over 2,000 years ago. Long before the name Hades was whispered in fearful reverence across Greek lands, the Greeks already lived side by side with death. But not as we know it. Death was not a domain. It was not ruled by a god, nor guarded by a three-headed beast. It was a shadow, unpredictable, formless. It had no king. To understand Hades, not just the god, but the idea of his realm, we must journey not to the depths of the earth, but backward, into mythic prehistory, a time before the Olympians reigned, before the cosmic order was imposed by thunderbolt or trident, a time ruled by primal forces, chaotic and ancient. This is where we begin, with the first death, and the first darkness, the Greek cosmos, a world born from void. The earliest Greek myths describe a universe that began not with light, not with a bang, but with a void. Chaos, a yawning nothingness, both womb and tomb. From chaos came Gaia, the earth herself, then Tartarus, the abyss, and Eros, love and desire, which would later bring order and continuity. Then came the primordial deities, Nyx night, Erebus darkness, and more abstract ideas like Moros, doom, Hypnos, sleep, and Thanatos, death. But not Hades, not yet. Thanatos was death, but not death as ruler. He was death as a force, a presence, cold, mechanical, and absolute. He had no judgment to offer. He simply ended life, as surely as a flame snuffed by wind. In these early myths, death wasn't about sin or punishment. It wasn't moralized. You died because it was your time, because fate Moira had cut your thread, and then you went somewhere or nowhere. That was the terrifying part. What happened next wasn't clear. There was no guide, no kingdom, no gates. The dead simply vanished. The unruled dead. Some ancient fragments speak of spirits wandering the world, unable to rest. Others suggest that all souls descended into Erebus, a misty place beneath the earth, lacking structure or purpose. A void within a void. The realm of the dead was not ruled, because death itself was not yet conceptualized as a place. In Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus descends into the underworld, he speaks to ghosts who drift like shadows, soulless, powerless echoes of the living. They need blood to even speak. There is no joy, no torment, just absence. Even Achilles, the greatest warrior, laments that he would rather be a slave on earth than a king among the dead. This tells us something critical. The Greeks didn't imagine death as fire and brimstone. They feared it for its stillness, not its cruelty. They feared being forgotten. They feared the silence, and this silence begged for a ruler. Enter the Titans. Before the Olympians came to power, the world was ruled by the Titans, the children of Gaia and Uranus, the sky. Among them was Cronus, the one who castrated his father and seized the throne. Cronus ruled over time, but not the peaceful ticking of a clock. He was devouring, endless, grinding time. And yet, he was not the god of death. That remained Thanatos' realm, still untouched. But something shifted in this era. The idea of boundaries began to form. Death started to gain shape, not as a passing moment, but as a transition, a place, a journey. The Greeks began to believe there was a realm where the dead might go, a realm beneath the living world. Tartarus had always existed, a prison, yes, but not yet an afterlife. It was reserved for monsters and traitors, like Uranus and later, the Titans. But what about normal mortals? What about the souls of shepherds, of children, of kings who had died without glory? The world demanded structure. Myth demanded balance. Just as the heavens had their kings, so too would the land of the dead. And so, the world turned once more. A war broke out. A war that would reshape the cosmos. The war for the cosmos. The Titanomachy was no mere battle, it was a cosmic reordering. Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon's sons of Kronos rebelled against their father and uncles. 10 years of cataclysmic war followed. Mountains shattered, oceans boiled, thunder clashed with eternal darkness, and when the dust settled, the Olympians emerged victorious. Now came the question, how would they divide this new universe? Zeus, with his thunderbolt and skyward gaze, took the heavens. Poseidon, restless and churning, claimed the sea. And Hades, he drew the shortest straw, or so they say. But here is where the myth turns. Hades' fate is often presented as tragic, even humiliating. Banished underground, away from Olympus, condemned to rule over shadows. But is that true? What if it was not a punishment, but a purpose? What if the underworld was not an exile, but a kingdom? What if Hades, rather than being cast aside, was entrusted with the most sacred duty of all, guarding the balance of life and death itself? To understand this, we must journey deeper, because only when we truly understand what the underworld was, what it became, and how it functioned, can we begin to grasp who Hades really isn't, who he never was. Not the devil, not evil, but the keeper of the dead, the quiet king of silence. The next part will lead us into the rise of Hades as ruler of the dead, the shaping of the underworld itself, and the true nature of his divine power. When Hades descended into his new realm, he did not enter a throne room. He entered a chaos, a place untamed, without walls or ceilings, where the cries of the newly dead echoed endlessly. A liminal space between what was and what would never be. Again, souls drifted. No judgment, no peace, no order. Death was a door, but no one had ever dared open it from the inside and build a home until now. Hades was not like his brothers. He did not roar with storms or crash with waves. He was quiet, observant, stern, and yet, beneath that silence burned something rare among the gods, an unwavering sense of responsibility. He did not protest his role. He did not seek Olympus. He did not beg for more. He built. He gave shape to death. The architecture of the afterlife, what Hades constructed, was not hell. It was not a place of eternal flames or demonic torment. It was a realm of destinations, of law, of judgment. The underworld became structured into 3 major regions. The Asphodel Meadows, a gray plain where most souls went, neither punished nor rewarded. These were the common dead. Farmers, merchants, children. Their lives had left. No grand stain, no divine mark. They simply were. Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, a paradise, lush and golden, reserved for heroes, poets, and the exceptionally virtuous. Here, the soul could enjoy eternal rest, or choose to be reborn. Reincarnation was possible, but only for those who had earned it. Only those who had been pure 3 times could enter the Isles of the Blessed. Tartarus, once a prison, now a place of torment, but only for the wicked. Here, the myth merges with justice. Cruel kings, oath-breakers, tyrants, these were not forgiven. They were condemned, but not by Hades. He did not judge. He only enforced. Judges of the dead judgment was handed down by 3 mortals turned divine, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iolcus. Once kings of the world, now kings beneath it. They listened to each soul's life, weighed its deeds, and passed verdict. Hades simply maintained the gates. He kept the balance. In this, he was not unlike a warden. The souls were not his to destroy or torment. They were his to protect, to hold, to ensure that none escaped, and that none disturbed the living. This was not a role of cruelty. It was a role of trust. And yet, outside of his realm, the world began to forget. Misunderstood silence to the Greeks. The underworld was a place of awe and dread, but not sin. The concept of sin as moral failure tied to punishment in the afterlife would not arrive until much later, influenced by Christianity and Zoroastrianism. But in the classical age, there was no Satan, no hellfire, and Hades was no devil. He did not tempt mortals. He did not rebel against Olympus. He never once tried to overthrow Zeus. In fact, Hades was perhaps the only major Olympian who never waged war against his kin. What made Hades feared was not evil but inevitability. He was the unavoidable, the final chapter, the last breath. His presence reminded mortals that glory fades, empires fall, and no offering could undo mortality. And yet, he was fair. Unlike Zeus, who was easily enraged, or Poseidon, who lashed out in storms, Hades was consistent. He did not chase after mortals for lust. He did not burn cities in anger. He ruled quietly and justly. But myths are not written by the dead. They are written by the living, and the living always fear what lies below. Symbols of sovereignty, though often shown as grim, Hades held symbols that tell a different story. The helm of darkness, or cap of invisibility, forged by the Cyclopes. This helm rendered the wearer unseen. It was a gift, not a curse, a token of respect from the elder forces of the world. Even gods feared its power. Hades used it to move unseen, in war but never to deceive. Cerberus, the three-headed dog, not a monster, but a guardian, loyal only to Hades. It was his sentinel, not to attack the innocent, but to prevent the living from entering and the dead from leaving. The Badent, while Zeus bore the thunderbolt and Poseidon the trident, Hades held a Badent, a staff. It was not a weapon of war. It was a symbol of his role, to pierce the veil between worlds, to shepherd the dead. The Narcissus and Cypress, flowers of mourning and transition, symbols of the boundary between life and death. These were sacred to Hades, not flame, not torment, but solemn beauty. Everything Hades carried was quiet, symbolic, and precise. There was no excess, no cruelty for cruelty's sake. He ruled with restraint, and that made him terrifying to those who feared the silence more than the scream. Naming the unnameable, perhaps the most telling sign of humanity's unease with Hades, is the way they spoke of him. They didn't, or rather, they avoided his name. To say Hades aloud was to invite his attention. Like many ancient cultures, the Greeks believed in the power of names. Instead, they called him Plauton, the giver of wealth, as all things beneath the earth, minerals, crops were his domain. The unseen one host of many these weren't insults. They were veiled compliments, euphemisms perhaps, but always tinged with respect. Hades did not demand temples or sacrifices. In fact, he rarely received them, not because he didn't deserve them, but because his presence was already everywhere. You could ignore Poseidon if you didn't sail. You could avoid Zeus by staying humble, but you could not escape Hades, and so he did not need to be worshipped. He simply waited, and he always received. In the beginning, he knew only darkness. Before he was crowned, before the underworld, before mortals whispered his name in fear, there was only one truth in the cosmos for the infant Hades. His father would devour him, and so he did, born to the Titan Cronus and the earth goddess Rhea. Hades came into a world not of lullabies and swaddling cloths, but of terror and betrayal. Cronus, warned by prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, chose to consume each newborn whole, a god devouring gods. First came Hestia swallowed, then Demeter, swallowed, then Hera, swallowed, then Hades. He did not scream, not because he was brave, but because there was no air, only the suffocating eternity of his father's belly, trapped in the still living womb of a tyrant. And in that prison, something inside Hades changed. He learned the stillness that would define his realm. He learned patience, and while his younger brother, Zeus, would be spared spirited away by Rhea and hidden in a cave on Crete, Hades waited for liberation, waited for his second birth. The rebellion of Zeuswen, the sixth child. Zeus reached manhood. He returned not as a son but as a challenger. With cunning and force, he confronted Cronus, and either through a magic elixir or divine force, compelled the Titan to vomit up the swallowed siblings, and so, one by one, gods were reborn into a world of war. First Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Imagine it, eons spent, entombed in your father's body, emerging into light, not with a cry of joy, but with the roar of vengeance. That was the crucible from which the gods of Olympus emerged. They were not nurtured, they were forged, and Hades was no exception. He emerged not as a boy, but as a full-grown god, and beside his brothers, he prepared for the greatest war the cosmos had ever known. Titanomachy, 10 years of chaos. The Titanomachy was not a battle, it was a saga, a cosmic upheaval. It split the sky, cracked the earth, and churned the seas. On one side stood the young Olympian Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, newborn deities of the next age. On the other, the Titans, Cronus and his kin, ancient, colossal, and unrelenting. Each Olympian brought their nature to the war. Zeus wielded lightning, fury, and storm. Poseidon shook mountains with his trident and drowned armies in waves. Hades did not bring thunder or flood. He brought fear. They say Hades fought with the helm of darkness, gifted by the Cyclopes, the same who forged thunder and earthquake. With it, he became invisible, the perfect assassin, the god of unseen strikes, of sudden death. While Zeus blinded and Poseidon crushed, Hades ended. The Titans were undone not by strength alone, but by precision, by inevitability, by the shadow they never saw coming. Hades learned. Then that war was not won through wrath alone, it was won through silence, through patience, through inevitability. The division of the cosmos after 10 years of endless war, the Olympians emerged victorious. The Titans were overthrown and cast into Tartarus, and now the universe lay open, untamed, divided. The three bros Zeus, Poseidon, Hades stood before the great cauldron of fate, and they drew lots. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, Hades drew the underworld. At least, that's how the myth goes. But was it truly chance? Or was it justice? The Greeks did not see this as punishment. Hades, in some versions, chose his domain. He was not banished, he was appointed, entrusted. The underworld was not a wasteland, it was half of existence. Every soul passed through it, every grave, every harvest, every end was under his gaze. To rule death was not shame, it was power. The brothers three, order from ruin, the division of realms, wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. Zeus, ever ambitious, needed a kingdom of dominance. He desired the vast skies, limitless and above all things. Poseidon, volatile and deep, took the oceans, untamable and ancient. Hades, introspective and resolute, ruled the depths, quiet, final and absolute. Each brother reflected their domain. Hades, often accused of isolation, did not visit Olympus often, but it wasn't from hatred. It was because his kingdom demanded it. The gates of the dead must never be left unguarded. No matter how the gods feasted above, Hades remained at his post, always. This was his role, not as devil, but as foundation. Without Hades, death would have no law, no peace, no barrier. Chaos would return, and so he stood, unseen, uncelebrated, but unbroken. After the war, Olympus rose, a gleaming palace atop the world, suspended between heaven and earth. The gods who had torn down the Titans now ruled in feasts, in glory, in unending golden brilliance. Music echoed, ambrosia flowed. The new gods celebrated their dominion over mortals, over nature, over time itself. But one throne stood empty. Hades did not come. He had no palace in the clouds, no seat among the Olympians, though he was one of the eldest, though he had fought beside them, though he had bled for their cause. He remained in the realm he had drawn, the dark, echoing silence beneath the world. This was not exile, it was choice. Hades had seen enough of ambition. He had watched his father devour children to avoid fate. He had seen the Titans claim eternity, only to lose it. Power was a flame, and too many gods burned in its light. So, he did not compete. He ruled what no one else wanted, and he ruled it absolutely. The nature of his rule, while Zeus hurled thunderbolts at Oathbreakers and Poseidon drowned kingdoms in waves, Hades did not send wrath into the world. He received what was already his. Every soul, every king, every slave, all would, in time, pass through his gates. He had no need for temples. His worship was written in the soil, in every funeral fire, in every tombstone. He did not demand blood, for blood flowed to him naturally. He had no mortal children, no divine tantrums. He simply ruled. The Greeks saw him not as malevolent, but as just, a god of contracts, oaths, and balance. No soul entered his realm before its time, but once they did, there was no return. That was the law, and Hades did not break law. He embodied it, brotherly tension despite their shared blood and shared victory. The relationship between the three brothers was complex. Zeus, as the king of the gods, claimed supreme authority, but he did not control all. He ruled Olympus and the sky, yes, but the sea was Poseidon's. The dead were Hades. In many myths, Zeus dares not overstep his brother's realm. Even the king of the gods had boundaries. Poseidon, with his tempestuous pride, clashed with Zeus. Frequently, earthquakes and storms were often the result of their disputes. But Hades, he rarely entered their feuds. He was not political. He did not seek Olympus' glory. He was, in many ways, the only one content with his fate, and that unsettled the others. He did not need admiration. He did not ask for love. He did not hunger to a god. That kind of silence is terrifying. Zeus's reign depended on fear and spectacle. Poseidon's dominion came through violence and unpredictability. But Hades, his power was eternal, unseen, unstoppable. Even gods would one day fall beneath his gaze, and he would be waiting. The cult of Hades, despite his minimal presence in popular myth. Archaeological evidence shows that Hades was not ignored. In the Orphic mysteries, and in secret rites scattered across Greece. Hades was venerated, but not like the others. No loud festivals, no grand sacrifices. He was worshipped in silence, in dark temples, in hidden rituals. His name was not spoken aloud. Offerings were buried in the earth, whispered into the cracks, poured into the soil. In some regions, he was merged with Plutona, god of wealth, not just riches, but the wealth of life's end. Every buried seed, every growing root, was a symbol of his dual nature, death as finality, and death as transformation. To the initiates of the mysteries, death was not a punishment. It was a passage, a return, and Hades was not an enemy. He was the ferryman's king, the ruler of thresholds. He stood not with a scythe, but with a key, and it unlocked not torment, but truth. A king beyond good and evil. This is the fundamental truth that centuries of Christian reinterpretation distorted. Hades is not evil. He does not tempt. He does not rebel. He does not punish out of spite. He holds the line. In the world of Greek myth, gods are not perfect. They are personifications of forces: lightning, sea, lust, wisdom, war. Zeus lies, Poseidon assaults, Hera rages, Ares kills. Even Athena, the goddess of wisdom, leads slaughter on battlefields. But Hades is consistent, stoic, final. He does not chase glory. He does not seduce mortals. He does not hurl the world into chaos. His sins are silence, distance, and inevitability. His virtue is order. He is the only Olympian who never breaks the natural law, because he is the law, and that is why he is feared, not because he is the devil, but because he is the mirror. He waits. At the end of every story, even the ones written by gods. The Greeks called it Hadu, the place of Hades, but this was no single cavern, no simple pit beneath the dirt. The underworld was vast, not in physical miles but in meaning. It was a spiritual topography, shaped not by tectonics, but by myth and mystery. It was not hell, it was not heaven, it was not purgatory. It was all of them and none of them. And unlike Olympus, which was radiant and distant, the underworld was close. You could enter through a cave, a crack, a sacred spring. The dead were not somewhere else, they were just beneath your feet. Entry to the underworld. The ancients believed the underworld had many entrances scattered across the known world. These necropolis cities of the dead were not just burial grounds, but gateways. The best known included Tanarum Cape Matapen in southern Greece, a yawning sea cave that was said to be an entrance to Hades, Lake Avernus in Italy, a volcanic crater that reeked of sulfur. Even birds were said to die if they flew over it. Heraclea Pontica on the Black Sea, where Heracles was said to have dragged Cerberus from the depths. Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites at places like Eleusis where initiates symbolically descended into the realm of Hades. But these were symbolic doors. The true entrance was always the same: death. There were no shortcuts, no exceptions. Even the gods, when they entered, risked never returning. The 5 rivers of the dead. As one crossed into the underworld, the landscape changed. It was not chaos, it was order, stark, shadowed, frighteningly symmetrical. Its boundaries were marked by 5 sacred rivers. Each carried more than water. They were emotions, experiences, states of being. Styx, the river of oaths, dark and binding. Even the gods swore upon it. To break a Styx oath meant exile from Olympus for 10 years. This river encircled the underworld 7 times. The river of pain, the river most souls crossed to enter the underworld. Not the punishment itself, but the pain of separation, of letting go of the living world. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, souls drank from it to forget their lives before reincarnation, a mercy, but also a loss. Phlegethon, the river of fire, a churning inferno, but not evil. It represented purification. Some myths said it flowed into Tartarus. Cocytus, the river of wailing, the river of unburied souls, of regret, cold, mournful, always echoing. Each river carved through the underworld, like a vein, through a heart. Together, they didn't just mark geography, they marked the journey of the soul. Charon, the ferryman upon death. The soul stood at the bank of Acheron, or Styx, where it met Charon, the grim ferryman. A skeletal or cloaked figure, draped in tattered robes. Charon demanded penunta, single obol, a coin placed under the tongue or on the eyes of the dead at burial. Without it, the soul was stranded. Wanderers, lost shades, unable to enter. Charon was not cruel. He simply followed the law. A soul unburied, a soul without the proper rites, could not pass. This is why funeral practices were sacred, why burial was a holy duty. The ferryman rode not just across water, but between worlds. He was the first servant of Hades you would ever meet. And if your coin was ready, the boat would drift silently forward, into the land where no heartbeat echoed. Cerberus, guardian of the Gaetat, the shore of the realm, stood Cerberus, the hound of Hades. 3 heads, serpents for a tail, eyes that burned with the memory of every soul who passed. He was not an attacker, he was a jailer. Cerberus let all souls in, but none back out to the Greeks. Cerberus represented not brutality, but irreversibility. Once you passed him, your name belonged to the dead. Many heroes tried to slip past Orpheus, Heracles, Aeneas, but only under divine exception or by trickery. Cerberus obeyed one master, and Hades did not give second chances. Beyond the rivers and Cerberus' gaze, the soul entered the deeper heart of Hades' realm. This was not a wasteland. This was a kingdom. And like any kingdom, it had provinces, hierarchies, laws, and guardians. Each part of the underworld reflected a truth about death, not in fire or glory, but in silence, memory, and consequence. There were three main regions: Asphodel Meadows, Elysium, and Tartarus, each representing not where you died, but how you lived. The Asphodel Meadows land of the forgotten, the largest part of the underworld, the default destination. If you lived an ordinary life, neither cruel nor heroic, this was where your soul drifted, not punished, not rewarded, simply present. A gray plain of tall, ghostly asphodel flowers. They swayed in a wind that never blew. There was no sun, no stars, just a dim twilight that never faded. Here, souls wandered, not in torment, but in forgetfulness. They had no names, no passions, no dreams. Memory, like color, had bled away. This was the Greek fear, not damnation, but oblivion, that your story would end, not with a cry, but with a quiet fading. Poets like Homer described these souls as fluttering shades, incapable of thought until given blood. No malice, no joy, just echoes. It is here, more than in Tartarus, that we find the Greek concept of non-heroic death, anonymous, inevitable, and passive. It was not evil, it was worse. It was silence. The Elysian fields reward beyond the veil, but not all were forgotten. If your life had been noble, if you had served the gods, died in glory, or upheld justice, you were not cast into Asphodel. You were granted entry to Elysium. Imagine golden light, meadows that bloomed forever, rivers of clear water, trees that bore fruit in all seasons, the music of lyres in the distance, the laughter of heroes. This was paradise, not distant in the clouds but beneath the earth, hidden and secret. Elysium was a reward for those who had earned immortality in spirit, not body. Here dwelled Orpheus, Achilles, Cadmus, and select mortals who had faced the trials of fate with grace and bravery. But even Elysium had levels. The Isles of the Blessed, a subsection, were reserved for the rarest souls, those who had lived 3 virtuous lives in a row, reincarnated and purified each time. This was not heaven, as understood in Christian theology. It was not a reward for belief, but for excellence. You could not beg your way into Elysium. You had to earn it, and if you did, you walked in golden fields, reborn in peace, beyond pain. Tartarus, the depths of judged evil far beneath, even Hades' throne, lay Tartarus. Originally, a place even the Titans feared, it became the prison of corrupted souls, not for mistakes, but for betrayal, for conscious, willful evil. You weren't thrown into Tartarus for being poor, or angry, or confused. You were sent here if you broke divine oaths, committed crimes against nature, or gods, lied under sacred contract, harmed the cosmos itself. Here were not simply tyrants, but examples. Tantalus, who fed his son to the gods, eternally starved beneath unreachable fruit. Sisyphus, the trickster king, forced to roll a boulder uphill for eternity. Ixion, who lusted after Hera, spun forever on a flaming wheel. These were not metaphors, they were cosmic lessons. And Hades did not torture them. Tartarus was self-enforcing. Its punishments were poetic, tailored to each crime, and crucially it was rare. Most souls did not go here. Greek myth reserved damnation, not for the flawed but for the monstrous. The judges of the dead. At the heart of the underworld stood 3 figures. Mortal born, but divinely elevated: Minos, former king of Crete, chief judge; Rhadamanthus, his brother, judge of eastern souls, and keeper of law; Iolcus, king of Aegina, judge of western souls, and gatekeeper. They listened to each soul's deeds, not by list, but by essence. You could not lie to them. The soul's truth was written in its very shape. You were not judged for what others said about you. You were judged for what your spirit had become. The judges did not reward obedience, but balance. They weighed actions, intentions, and consequences, and after judgment, the soul was sent to Elysium, Asphodel, or Tartarus. Spirits, shades, and guardians. The underworld was not empty. It teemed with life. The Erinyes Furies, born from the blood of Uranus, they punished oathbreakers and murderers. Even gods feared them. Hypnos sleep, and Thanatos death, twin spirits. Gentle and final, Hypnos offered rest. Thanatos escorted souls. Hecate, goddess of magic, and Crossroads, a frequent visitor to Hades' court. Melanu and Macaria, daughters of Hades, representing ghostly apparitions and merciful death. Hermes Psychopompos, the only Olympian permitted to enter and exit freely. He guided souls to the gates, and countless shade souls in every state of rest, wandering, or rebirth. A kingdom of necessity, this was Hades' realm. It did not glow, it did not burn, it did not beg for prayer. It existed because it had to. It held what the living could not bear, the end. But Hades did not twist it. He shaped it, organized it, guarded it. Where others saw horror, he saw duty. Where others fled, he stood. He is not evil. He is not cruel. He is the God who makes death not meaningless but bearable. There was once a time when she was only a girl. Her name was Cori, the maiden. She danced in the fields of the upper world, surrounded by poppies and sunlight, her laughter carried by the wind. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and in her mother's eyes, she was everything good and pure. The grass grew greener where she stepped. Trees seemed to bloom at her arrival. She was not yet a queen, not yet a goddess of death. She was spring personified life at its beginning. But the gods are rarely allowed to remain innocent. One day, as Cori wandered through a meadow gathering wildflowers, her eyes were caught by something different, a narcissus, pale and glowing, unlike the others. She reached for it, and the earth opened. No thunder, no fire, just the silent splitting of the world. From that yawning crack rose a chariot drawn by obsidian horses, pulled from the shadows by a figure none dared name aloud, Hades, the Lord of the Dead. He emerged not in rage or fire, but in quiet inevitability. He saw her and did not hesitate. He did not ask. He took thought in a blink. The girl was gone, swallowed by the land. The meadow stood silent once more, as though nothing had ever happened. But one mother noticed. Demeter felt her daughter's absence. As a blade through the chest, she searched. She wandered. She screamed into temples, questioned the stars, cursed Olympus. No one answered, not even Zeus. The earth began to wither under her grief. Fields turned to dust. Fruit blackened on the vine. Mortals starved. Cities crumbled. She made the world mourn with her, and all the while, beneath the crust of the world, Cori sat in a throne room carved of stone in silence. Hades had brought her to his realm not as a prisoner in chains, but as a guest, a queen to be. He spoke not with cruelty, but with gravity. He showed her the rivers that ran through the dead, the judges who weighed mortal lives, the order he had built from chaos. She was not mistreated. She was not assaulted, but she was held, and slowly she began to change. There are stories that say she resisted him, that she wept, that she refused all food, all drink, to preserve her tie to the world above. But even the strongest will bends under time. In the silence of the underworld, she saw herself reflected, no longer a child, no longer a blossom, but a figure of weight. She was being asked not just to stay, but to reign. It is said that Hades offered her a gift, not gold, not jewels, but a fruit from his realm, a pomegranate. Blood-red seeds, ripe with meaning. She took it. Some say she was tricked. Others say she chose. She ate 6 seeds, and everything changed. Above, Demeter had reached the edge of madness. She had threatened Zeus. She had threatened the world. "Return my daughter," she cried, "or let all the earth die." Even Zeus, king of the gods, knew this was not a threat. It was prophecy. He sent Hermes to retrieve the girl. But when the messenger reached the underworld, he found a queen, not a captive. She had eaten the fruit, and so the law of death was written. A compromise was struck. For 6 months of the year, Persephone no longer, Corey would return to her mother. And for 6, she would dwell with Hades as queen of the underworld. And thus, the seasons were born. When she arose, Demeter rejoiced. The earth bloomed, crops flourished. Spring returned. When she descended, Demeter grieved. The fields died. Winter crept across the land. But this myth was never truly about the harvest. It was about the journey. The loss of innocence. The crossing from maiden to sovereign. Persephone was no longer a child. She had been to the end of the world and come back changed. She was not Hades' victim. She was his mirror. She was not just queen of the dead. She was the goddess who walked between worlds. In later mysteries, whispered in dark temples and hidden rites, it was said that Persephone was the true judge of souls. That she held the keys, not just to the underworld, but to rebirth itself. That to die without honoring her was to wander forever, lost. She wore 2 crowns, life and death, and none could wear them but her. Hades had not stolen her. He had revealed her. The gods are not moral. They are not human. But if there is one love story in all of Greek mythology untouched by chaos, betrayal, or lust, it is this strange and quiet one. Hades took a maiden. Persephone returned as a queen, and the world was never the same again. He never had horns. He never carried a pitchfork. He didn't tempt mortals, or punish sin, or scream in sulfurous rage. And yet today, his name evokes fire, torture, red skin, and monstrous cruelty. To say Hades in the modern world is to summon the image of the devil. But that was never who he was. Not to the Greeks, not to the Greeks, not to the Romans. Not until the world changed. In the earliest myths, Hades was not feared because he was wicked. He was feared because he was absolute. He did not break rules, he enforced them. He did not punish for pleasure. He maintained balance. He did not rebel. He stayed at his post, while others pursued glory in the sky or sea. But centuries later, the myths began to warp, not by accident, by intention. The world moved on. New religions rose, with new gods and new enemies, and in their quest to convert, to dominate, and to replace, they took the old world's gods and rewrote them as devils. In ancient Greece, Hades had no interest in the souls of the wicked. He was not a tormentor. The wicked were judged by the laws of the dead, not by his whim. The punishments of Tartarus were poetic, not sadistic. They were mirrors of the crimes committed in life, not eternal torture, designed to break a soul. But by the time the Roman Empire fell into Christian hands, everything beneath the earth became a threat. The Hebrew Sheol, the early Christian Gehenna, and the classical Hades were merged, blended, and reimagined into a singular location, hell, and someone had to rule that hell. They chose Hades, but not the one the Greeks knew. They gave him horns. They gave him cloven hooves. They gave him Lucifer's rebellion. But Hades never rebelled. He never waged war against Zeus, never tempted mortals into betrayal. He never challenged Olympus, nor sought a throne that was not his. He was content with silence. He remained in his realm, and perhaps that's why they turned on him. In a world that increasingly saw duality, good versus evil, light versus dark, Hades' neutrality became suspicious. The fact that he didn't seek worship, didn't demand offerings, didn't come to Olympus, that was seen not as humility, but as aloofness. Isolation was rebranded as exile, stillness as wickedness. They forgot he was a king, and kings who are forgotten become monsters in stories. By the Middle Ages, paintings of Hades were indistinguishable from depictions of Satan. He became the red-skinned tormentor, seated on a throne of skulls, no longer a silent god of the dead, now a howling lord of sin. Even the word Hades stopped meaning a deity. It became a place of flames instead of shadows. But the ancient Greeks would not have recognized this demon. Their Hades ruled over a domain that every god respected. Even Zeus sent messages to the underworld with care. When heroes like Orpheus, Theseus, or Heracles dared to enter, they went with trembling. Not because Hades was cruel, but because his kingdom obeyed. Different laws. To die was not to be judged by Hades' mood, it was to be measured in fairness and finality. There was no room for chaos in the realm of the dead. That was what made it terrifying. It wasn't the heat, it wasn't the pain, it was the stillness, the certainty. The gods of Olympus were unpredictable. They could be bribed, appeased, seduced. Hades could not be moved, and that frightened those who preferred their gods to be human. The devil, in Christian tradition, is a tempter, a liar, a betrayer. He seeks your fall. Hades never sought yours. He simply waited. He did not rise from the pit to offer you power in exchange for your soul. He received your soul because your thread had ended. He did not steal it. He guarded it. To the ancients, Hades wasn't evil. He was necessary. He represented the boundary, the thing no one escapes, no matter how high they build or how loudly they pray. But modernity is uncomfortable with neutral gods. The ancient world allowed gods to be complex, capable of both kindness and terror. But modern faiths demanded alignment. A god must be good, a devil must be evil. And so Hades was assigned his role, not because he changed, but because we did. He became a shadow of our own fears, a projection of our guilt, a symbol, not of death itself, but of what we think death means. In truth, Hades was always the same, quiet, orderly, watchful. He did not seduce, he did not revolt. He stood at the end of every road and welcomed you, as he always had, not with fire, but with silence. It was said that no mortal could leave the land of the dead, and yet some tried. They came not as shadows, but as flesh, with hearts still beating, eyes still open, breathing the air of the living, even as they stepped onto the soil of the dead. Each had a reason, a mission, a wound that could not be healed in the world above, and each one would learn. The underworld was not meant for the living. The first to descend in song and sorrow was Orpheus, the greatest musician the world had ever known. His voice could calm storms, his lyre could tame beasts. Even the trees bent toward his song. But none of it mattered when Eurydice died. She died young. Some say it was a snake. Some say it was fate. But whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Her soul was lost to the underworld, and Orpheus could not accept it. He did not pray to Hades from afar. He did not beg on mountaintops. He took his lyre and walked downward, through caves and cracks, past the places where the sun has never touched. No mortal had ever gone so far. When he stood before the gates, Cerberus did not snarl. He listened. Orpheus played a song so sorrowful that the very rocks wept. The dead themselves paused. Even the Furies, born of blood and vengeance, shed tears, and Hades listened. He did not hurl the mortal out. He did not punish him for daring to enter. Instead, he made a deal. Eurydice could return, but Orpheus must lead the way. He must not look back, not once, not until they both stood beneath the open sky. He agreed, and so they walked her footsteps silent, his heart racing. But fear is a cruel thing. Just before they reached the surface, Orpheus turned. He needed to be sure. He needed to see her, and in that instant, she vanished. Not punished, not cursed. She had simply not yet crossed the threshold, and the law was clear. Hades had kept his word. It was Orpheus who failed. Another who descended was Heracles, son of Zeus, in a trial unlike any other, the 12th labor, to bring back Cerberus himself. Not a token, not a coin, the very guardian of the gates. He came not in sorrow, but in strength. He battled monsters, passed rivers, faced the judges, and when he stood before Hades, he made his request. Hades did not rage, he did not refuse. He allowed Heracles to take Cerberus, but on one condition: no weapons, no harm. If he could subdue the beast with his bare hands, he could lead him to the world above, and Heracles did. He wrestled the great hound into submission, not with hatred, but with will, and he returned to the surface, victorious. But even Heracles gave the beast back. He did not try to keep what belonged to the dead, and Hades did not strike him down, because Heracles understood the boundary. Others were not so fortunate. Theseus and Pirithous, sons of pride and folly, descended into the underworld with ambition. They did not come for justice or sorrow. They came to steal, to abduct Persephone herself, and make her a bride again, this time for pure show. It was a joke among gods, a crime among mortals, and Hades smiled. He invited them to sit, to rest, to feast, and when they did, they found themselves bound not with chains, but with stone. The earth itself held them. They became part of the realm. They sought to mock. Years passed. Only Theseus was later freed by Heracles. Pirithous remained still seated, still waiting, a warning carved into myth. Still others came with questions. Odysseus, in his journey home, sought the wisdom of the dead, not to steal, not to defy, but to understand. He performed the proper rites. He sacrificed to the dead. He poured blood into the ground, and when the souls rose, they spoke. Even the prophet Tiresias, even his mother, even Achilles, Odysseus, did not try to change fate. He listened, and he returned. Not every journey to the underworld is an act of defiance. Some are acts of surrender, a reminder that the land of the dead is not evil. It is truth. It does not lie. It does not flatter. It strips away the illusions of life and leaves only essence in every myth. Those who entered the realm of Hades came away changed, not because they saw flames, but because they saw themselves. That was Hades' greatest power. He did not destroy, he revealed, and those who returned brought the weight of that knowledge back to the world above. Some broke under it. Some were humbled. All were marked, because to look into the eyes of the God of the dead is to remember that all things end. Even stories, even gods, even heroes, but not Hades. He remains, as he always has. They called him the Unseen One, not because he lurked or stalked, but because no one wished to look. Hades did not appear in dreams like Zeus. He did not stir the sea or unleash tempests. He did not hurl fire or rain gold. He did not ask for temples. He did not boast, but his presence was constant, like gravity, like silence, like consequence. He was not a god of punishment. He was the god of order. He held the balance between life and death, between law and chaos, between promise and betrayal. In a pantheon of impulsive, emotional gods, he was the only one who never broke his role. He did not interfere in mortal wars. He did not seduce or trick. He did not play favorites. He enforced the rules, even when others refused to. And in the ancient world, the most sacred of all laws was the oath. An oath in Greece was not a promise, it was a binding force, a thread sewn through the soul. To break an oath was not just a light, was cosmic treason. The gods could lie to mortals, cheat one another, and rage across the heavens, but when an oath was sworn on the river Styx, even Zeus himself was subject to its weight, because the river Styx belonged to Hades, and he did not forgive. No one swore on Hades' name lightly. To do so meant you were willing to stake your fate on the eyes of the God who sees all endings. It meant that you were willing to be judged after death, when the masks had fallen and the truth could not be hidden. Even the gods could not escape that reckoning. This is what made Hades powerful, not through force, but through finality. He had no army, no lightning bolt. His power was in the fact that all things, eventually, were his. And in that inevitability, he enforced the highest justice of all the rights of the dead. Among the Greeks, no sin was greater than to deny burial. To leave a body unburied was to trap the soul between worlds, unable to reach the underworld. A rotting corpse was not just a horror, it was a spiritual crime. Mourning, cremation, the coin for Quran, these were not customs. They were laws, and they were Hades' laws. To violate them was to provoke not thunder, not plague, but silence, eternal wandering. The shade of the unburied became a restless ghost, unable to enter the judgment of the three kings. They would hover near the banks of Acheron forever, crying for coin, for earth, for fire. Even murder, in some cases, could be forgiven. But leaving the dead exposed, that was a curse beyond reckoning. When the warrior Achilles desecrated Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot, even the gods recoiled. And it was only when Priam, Hector's father, begged for the return of the corpse, and rites were performed, that balance was restored. Because even vengeance has limits. Hades demands honor, not in battle, but in endings. This was not sentiment. It was structured. The underworld relied on the separation of worlds, the living above, the dead below. When the dead were denied their place, everything tilted. The cycle broke. Ghosts rose. Plagues came. Madness followed. The Greeks believed that cities rose and fell, not by politics or war, but by how they treated their dead. This is why funerals were holy, why every family, no matter how poor, buried their kin with care, why coins were placed under the tongue, eyes were closed, and the name was spoken aloud one last time, because to do otherwise was to invite the attention of the one God, who did not forget. Hades did not punish with fire, he punished with remembrance, and that was worse. To wander as a ghost, unnamed, unloved, unburied, was the deepest horror imaginable. It meant the soul could not rest, could not be judged, could not be reborn. It meant you had no place. You were erased from the cosmic order, and in Greek belief, that was the closest thing to hell. It is this understanding that makes Hades different from every other god. Zeus wielded power through spectacle, Poseidon through force, Athena through wisdom, Ares through blood. Hades ruled through consequence. He didn't come to the living, he waited for them, and when they arrived, he did not rage. He did not rage. He simply asked, "Were you buried? Were you mourned? Did you keep your oaths? Did you honor the laws that transcend kingdoms? If you had, he granted you your place. If not, he let the world remember what you had done." In later cults, like the Orphic Mysteries, Hades was even reimagined, not as the end, but as the judge who could send a soul toward reincarnation, or even to union with the divine. In these rites, the soul who had lived well-honored oaths, buried kin, respected boundaries could escape the wheel of rebirth and ascend to the Isles of the Blessed. In this, Hades became more than a ruler. He became the gatekeeper to transcendence, not with fire, but with silence. The silence that waits when the world has said all it can say. The silence where truth lives. The silence where judgment comes not in fury, but in balance. He did not sit at the feasts, when the Olympians gathered in golden halls, when goblets overflowed and laughter echoed into the sky. One throne remained cold, not because it was forbidden, because he chose not to come. Hades was never cast out of Olympus. He was not exiled. He was not fallen. He was one of the eldest, one of the three rulers of the cosmos. Sky, sea, and underworld divided equally among brothers. Yet, while Zeus thundered from the heights and Poseidon stirred the deep, Hades kept to the shadows below, and the others were content to leave him there. They did not mock him. They did not provoke him. They simply did not speak of him. There was something in his silence that unsettled even gods. Zeus, the king of kings, was loud, proud. He demanded worship, sent omens, threw bolts. He was always watching, always judging, always needing to be seen. Poseidon roared with storms. He smashed cities, rattled the earth, flooded temples in his fury. His moods were known to all, but Hades did not act out. He did not seek mortal adoration. He did not stir wars or seduce queens, and that made him dangerous in a way the others were not. Not because he was a threat, but because he didn't need anything from them. Even the gods, who saw themselves as immortal, knew deep down that they were not eternal. Not truly. Time wore, even on Olympus. Empires fell, altars decayed, names faded. But at the end of all of it, Hades would remain. He had no need to conquer. He already owned what they would one day become, and they knew it. Still, they were more powerful when he emerged, when the gods looked into the face of the unseen one and remembered why he ruled alone. There was the time when Apollo's son, Asclepius, grew too skilled in healing. He began to raise the dead, not metaphorically, literally. He broke the barrier, reversed fate. Life flowed back where death had claimed its due, and Hades took notice. He rose from his kingdom and climbed to Olympus not with wrath, but with law. He stood before Zeus and spoke only once. If the dead are no longer dead, then the order of the world has collapsed. Zeus did not argue. He hurled a thunderbolt and struck Asclepius down, not for crime, but for imbalance. The dead belonged to Hades, not out of greed, but out of necessity. Even the gods could not append that truth. In another myth, the gods debated the fate of a man named Sisyphus, trickster, deceiver, oathbreaker. He had escaped death once, then twice. He had bound Thanatos in chains. He had mocked Hades' order. And so when he finally died, truly and completely, there was no trial. There was only Tartarus. His punishment was not flames or whips, but eternity made meaningless, pushing a stone that would never stay, labor with no reward. It was not torture, it was cosmic irony, and it was Hades who ensured that punishment, held not personally, not with violence, just by watching and letting the law unfold. Even when the gods challenged death directly, they went carefully. When Demeter threatened Olympus over Persephone, it was Hades who kept calm. He did not rage at being asked to release his queen. He did not fight. He reminded them she had eaten of the fruit. She had crossed the line. He had not kidnapped a soul. He had made a pact, and even Zeus, ruler of sky and Othenard, that pact because some laws are older than gods. Even the younger Olympians held their tongues around Hades. Ares, god of war, loved violence, but he rarely entered the underworld. Dionysus, god of madness, rarely descended. Even Hermes, who moved freely between worlds, was never flippant with the god below. He guided souls, yes, but he did not linger. He knew the weight of the gates. Only Persephone treated him as an equal, because she was his equal. Together they ruled not as lovers of spectacle, but as keepers of the great turning, birth, death, return. The others may have had palaces in the clouds or thrones in the sea, but Hades had something they never could: permanence. In a world where gods rose and fell with mortal belief, he remained untouched, worshipped in secret, whispered not shouted, and feared not because he was cruel, but because he could not be avoided. Even the gods, in the quiet of their temples, must have sometimes wondered, when the last offering is given, when Olympus is silent and forgotten, when even the sun fades, who will be left? And they must have known the answer. Not Zeus, not Poseidon, only the one who never needed their approval, only the one who never left his post, only the one who never broke his role, the king of the dead, the god of silence, Hades. To the Greeks, Death was never far. It lingered in the fields, in the hearth, in every cracked tombstone on the road's edge. You didn't need to see Hades to feel him. He was part of life. Not spoken of loudly, not worshipped in the open, but understood, respected, feared, not because he struck without cause, but because he never failed to arrive, and so they prepared. From the moment a person took their final breath, the process began, not of fear, but of transition. The soul, they believed, did not vanish. It traveled, crossed thresholds, faced judgment, and for that journey, it needed guidance. The body was washed and anointed, usually by women of the household. They weren't just cleansing flesh, they were preparing the vessel for its final role. Eyes were closed, the mouth was sealed. A coin, an obol, was placed under the tongue or between the teeth. This was not superstition. It was fair payment for Charon, the ferryman. Without that coin, the soul was stranded, wandering the banks of Acheron for eternity, unable to cross, unable to rest, to die without burial, without coin, without name. This was the true horror, worse than Tartarus. It meant being unseen, even by the god of the unseen. The body was displayed for mourning. Songs were sung, laments cried aloud, not to shock, but to release grief, to allow the soul to feel the love it left behind. Then came the ekpharat, the funeral procession. Before dawn, the dead were carried to the tomb, sometimes cremated, sometimes buried. Always honored. Even the poor found a way to give their dead the rites. To bury a man without a coin, without oil, without lament, that was not poverty, it was shame. For the Greeks believed that Hades was not just watching the dead, but watching how the living treated them. A grave was more than a resting place. It was a boundary stone between worlds. The tomb was a doorway, not always locked. Offerings were left: wine, olive oil, milk, honey, not to appease, but to sustain. The soul might return, not in vengeance, but in longing, and when it did, it should not be hungry. On certain days each year, especially during Antisteria, a festival of the dead, the Greeks believed the underworld opened. The souls came back to roam the earth. Doors were smeared with pitch, silent. Meals were left out. The living did not speak the names of the dead, not in fear, but in deference. They understood. The dead are not gone. They are elsewhere. And Hades, their king, is not a jailer. He is a host. He watches not only those who pass through his gates, but those who send them there. To deny burial was to offend him. To forget the dead was to erase the contract. The dead gave meaning to the living. Memory kept the world intact. Even the great Homeric epics are soaked in funerary rituals. Achilles would not rest until Patroclus was buried. Priam risked everything to retrieve Hector's body. When Odysseus called forth the dead, he poured blood into a trench, not as magic, but as invitation. Only through the blood could the dead speak. Only with respect could they rise. And in certain corners of Greek life, the line between worlds became thin. There were oracles of the dead. Priests and initiates called upon the shades, not in horror, but in reverence. They descended into caverns carved deep into the rock, passed through labyrinthine corridors, performed sacred rites, and waited for the response. Not every shade answered. Not every question was safe. The dead are not toys. They are not servants. They are not gone. The Greeks knew this, and so they lived among the dead. Roadside tombs, household shrines, burial grounds, built into city walls. You might pass your grandmother's resting place on the way to the market. You might speak her name before cooking dinner. You might pour out a bit of wine for the father who taught you to pray. It was not worshipped, it was continuity, a line that did not break, only changed direction. Hades was not hovering above in anger. He was there just beneath your feet, not as a monster, but as the quiet reminder that life, to be meaningful, must be bookended. The Greeks lived with that knowledge. They built temples for Apollo, shrines for Artemis, cities for Athena, but for Hades, they whispered, they buried, they remembered. That was his temple, that was his priesthood, and when they died, they went not into flame, but into a story, and that story passed, like all others, into the hands of the God who forgets nothing, the God who does not leave, the God who waits. There is a name he wore that many forget, Plauton the Wealth, Bringer. It sounds strange at first. Hades, the god of the dead, associated with gold, abundance, and fertility. It seems a contradiction. What does death have to do with wealth? To the Greeks, everything. The earth was the giver of all things, grain, fruit, roots, ores, gems. What lived did so because it was drawn up from the soil, and what died returned to it. The same ground that held the dead also birthed the living. Beneath the surface, unseen, lay the seed and the skeleton. One fed the other. And Hades ruled both. He was not just a god of endings. He was a god of hidden things. Wealth, in the ancient mind, did not lie in visible abundance. It was found in what was buried: gold veins deep in the rock, silver lodes beneath mountains, grain sleeping beneath furrowed earth. All of it passed through the hands of Hades, not because he claimed it, but because it was his domain. But everything beneath your feet belonged to him. The poets understood this. They did not call him just Hades. In certain rites, in mysteries whispered in underground sanctuaries, they invoked Plutona, named softer, wealthier, less feared. But it was the same god, not changed, just seen from a different angle. To the initiate, the difference was clear. Hades was not the enemy of life. He was necessary for it. The seed dies before it grows. The field must be tilled, broken to bloom. The miner must go downward to bring treasure upward. In this way, Plauton became more than a euphemism. He became the bridge between decay and abundance. To those who saw only the surface, Hades was the god of death. To those who understood the roots, he was the god of generation. Even Demeter, goddess of harvest, could not bless the fields without his allowance. Her daughter Persephone spent half the year in his kingdom, and when she returned, the grain returned with her. The ancients did not see this as tragedy. They saw it as balance, as rhythm. The death of one season meant the birth of another. The wealth of the world did not fall from the sky. It rose from the dark, in statues of Plauton. He holds a cornucopia horn of plenty, not stolen, not ironic, earned, because without his shadow, there is no contrast for light. Without his depth, there is no height. Without his stillness, there is no movement. And just as every city had its market, its altar, its agora, it also had its graveyards, its mines, its vaults, all guarded by the god they rarely spoke of, yet always obeyed. Even kings bowed to Plauton, because no matter how much gold they stored, it all came from his realm, and it would return to him. Gold placed in tombs was not a gift to the dead. It was a gesture to the god beneath them, a recognition that wealth, no matter how dazzling, would eventually rust, melt, or be buried again. Plauton does not envy the rich. He receives them as he receives the poor, the powerful, the forgotten. All return to his halls, and all their treasures, in time, line the walls of his invisible palace, not as trophies, but as reminders that wealth is not what is seen, it is what is held in secret. He was not a god of greed, he was a god of value, and to the Greeks, the truest value was found not in what could be spent, but in what endured. Memory, legacy, soil, stone, gold, pulled from the darkness, and souls returned to the earth. The name Plauton was not a mask. It was a truth too deep for casual eyes, a reminder that the god of the dead was not cold. He was rooted, and from his depths came all things: death, yes, but also grain, riches, and life itself. There were temples for Zeus, for Athena, for Apollo. Columns tall as trees, altars smoking with sacrifice, processions that danced in sunlight. But not for Hades. His rites were hidden, his teachings passed in whispers, underground, not because he was shameful, but because he was sacred. Some truths, the Greeks believed, are too powerful for the open air, and so they veiled them in caves, in silence, in darkness. There beneath the surface of daily life, two great spiritual movements emerged and later, the Orphic mysteries. They both revolved around the same truth, that death was not final, and that Hades was not a god of despair. He was the guardian of something deeper. The Eleusinian mysteries were held once a year, for over 1,000 years, just outside Athens. No one who was initiated ever revealed what they saw. No records, no scripts, no details survived because what was revealed could not be spoken. But we know this much. It began with Persephone, her descent, her return, the great grief of Demeter, and the silence of Hades. This myth, one the people had heard since childhood, was reenacted in solemn procession. Thousands marched from Athens to Eleusis, carrying torches into the night. They fasted. They purified themselves. They entered a great hall, the Telesterion, where the mystery was unveiled. We do not know what was shown, but we know how it changed them. Initiates emerged, transformed, no longer fearing death, no longer seeing the underworld as doom. It was not a place of punishment. It was a place of truth, of return. They believed the soul was not trapped. It could rise because Persephone had risen, because Hades had allowed it. He had not forbidden her. He had given her a place in these rites. Hades was not the villain. He was the keeper of cycles. The Orphics took this even further. They were wanderers, mystics, poets. Their writings, found in scraps of golden tablets placed in graves, described the journey of the soul through lifetimes. They believed that the soul came from the divine, fell into the body like a prison, and after death, passed through judgment. If the soul had lived wisely, if it had been purified, remembered its divine nature, and rejected excess, it could escape the cycle of rebirth and ascend. But to ascend, it needed knowledge, a password, an understanding of the realm it would pass through. So they taught their followers secret names. They taught them the geography of Hades' land. They taught them to say after death, I am the child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. They taught them to reject Lethia, the river of forgetting, to drink instead from Mnemosyne, memory, because in memory was freedom, in memory was return. These teachings weren't about sin or forgiveness. They were about awakening. And at the center of that awakening was Hades, not as judge, but as gatekeeper. The Orphics portrayed him alongside Persephone not as tormentor and victim, but as twin pillars. He held the keys. She held the door. Together, they ruled the space between death and something greater. The underworld was not a pit, it was a chamber, a passage. You were meant to go through it, not to be trapped in it. That was the secret. That was the truth kept from the open world. And that was why the rites were hidden. Because once you saw death for what it was, not horror, but transition, you could no longer be controlled. You could no longer be ruled by fear. You no longer begged the gods for mercy. You faced the end with open eyes. And in that gaze, Hades waited not as an executioner, but as a priest, a king of silence, a guardian of secrets, the one who waited at the end of the journey, not with flame, but with a question. Did you remember? Did you learn? Are you ready? Those who understood walked calmly to the grave. They carried the password. On their tongue they drank from the right spring, and they passed through the gates, not as victims, but as initiates. When the curtain rose in ancient Athens, it was not just entertainment, it was ritual. The theater carved into stone at the foot of the Acropolis was a sacred space, not for laughter alone, but for truth, for blood, for fate, for gods, and no, God loomed larger in silence than Hades. He was rarely named, rarely shown, but he was always there, behind the words, behind the deaths, behind the screams, because in Greek tragedy, death was not an event, it was a presence, and that presence had a name. Hades. He never walked on stage, never shouted, never sang, yet every time a character took their own life, was struck down by prophecy, or whispered final words, the audience knew he was watching. The Greeks feared chaos, feared the breakdown of order. But what they feared even more was hubris, the defiance of the gods, the challenge of fate. And in tragedy, that defiance always ended the same way. In Descent, Oedipus, who sought to outrun his fate, blinded himself and walked into exile. Antigone, who refused to leave her brother unburied, descended into a tomb by choice. Her voice echoed from beneath the earth. She spoke not to Zeus, not to Apollo, but to the gods below, to Hades, to the old law that demanded the dead be honored. Even above the laws of kings, she did not fear him, she trusted him, because unlike men, unlike tyrants, unlike the gods who changed their minds, Hades would not forget her act. He would know, he would remember, he would receive. In that, tragedy became theology. It was not a spectacle of gore, it was a conversation with death. The audience watched as mortals broke against inevitability. They wept, not because the characters suffered, but because they had to, because the story could only end one way. That is the core of Hades, not cruelty, inevitability. When Medea kills her children, she does so not out of madness alone, but out of certainty. She knows they cannot survive the world she has shattered. Their blood flows toward the underworld, toward the only God who does not judge by emotion. And when her chariot carries her away, she leaves their bodies behind, not unburied, but unfinished. The audience knew the price. Creon knew it too. In Antigone, he banned the burial of Polynices out of pride. He forbade mourning. He placed himself above the gods of death, and for that, he lost everything. His son, his wife, his legacy, because Hades does not tolerate imbalance. You may rule cities, you may command armies, but if you deny the dead, you will be answered. In Greek tragedy, even the powerful die, especially the powerful, and when they fall, they do not go to Olympus, they go below, where names mean little, where only the soul remains in the Bacchae. Euripides shows Dionysus himself drive mortals to madness. They tear flesh, they lose identity, and when the dust settles, the dead lie scattered, but not forgotten. They are not lost. They are accounted for. Hades waits in the wings. The greatest tragedy of all is not death, it is death without dignity. And that is where the fear comes in. To die wrongly, to be denied rights, to be erased, and so. Each tragic death is followed by layum, ntation. By burial, by ritual, because the audience knew they were not just watching actors, they were watching souls, crossing, descending, being judged. They were watching Hades, not as a monster, but as a mirror. The final scene was not the last breath, it was the moment the soul disappeared, and behind that moment stood a king, unseen, unmoving, waiting always. Empires rise, languages shift, names change, but the gods remain. When Greece fell under Rome, her myths did not vanish, they were absorbed, translated, draped in Latin. The gods took on new faces, new meanings, new masks, and so Hades, the somber king of the Greek underworld, became Pluto. The name was not random, it was chosen with care. Plauton, the giver of riches, became Dispater to the Romans, father of wealth, and from him, the Latin world shaped Pluto, a figure more formal, more imperial, less feared than his Greek predecessor, but no less final. The Romans did not fear death as an end, they feared it as judgment. Life, to a Roman, was duty, law, legacy. What mattered was whether you upheld the order of the world, Mosmai Arum, the way of the ancestors, and Pluto became the silent guardian of that order. He was not described in flames or fury. He was described in silence, in law, in the finality of the grave, in Roman homes. The dead were not sent away, they were kept close. Their Lares household spirits were worshipped daily. Their names were carved into stone in the columbaria, nestled within city walls. The tomb was not just a resting place, it was a civic monument, and Pluto ruled over all of them. The Roman underworld was a city of its own. It had roads, walls, gates. The journey after death was mapped with precision. The soul crossed the river, was greeted by Pluto's servant Charon, Cerberus, and the fate's judgment was passed by Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iolcus, still present, still respected, but in Rome. Pluto did not hover in myth alone. He entered philosophy. He became a concept to the Stoics. Death was natural. It was neither good nor bad, simply was, a necessary phase of life. Seneca wrote of it as a return to nature, a falling into the rhythm of the cosmos. And Pluto, though still called a god, became more than divine. He became inevitability personified, not wrathful, not vengeful. Inevitable. The Stoic did not tremble before him. He greeted him with calm. Death could not be avoided, so it must be understood, accepted, even embraced. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, wrote in his Meditations that death was not to be feared. It is part of the process. If you don't like it, you might as well not like nature. That was the Roman Pluto. Less myth, more principle, but not without power. In Roman law, testaments' wills often began with invocations of Pluto, not to beg for mercy, but to acknowledge his jurisdiction. Once the words were spoken, the rest belonged to him. Land, names, memory. Even emperors bowed to this. Their bodies burned on pyres, their ashes interred in monuments, but always with ritual, always with passage. The gates of Pluto's realm were never approached casually. Even in war, his name was respected. When Rome's generals crossed into battle, they did not only pray to Mars, they whispered to Pluto as well, because war was not only about victory, it was about who would receive the dead. Pluto was not a demon. He was not a judge. He was a custodian, and when Rome expanded, his name went with it, across the Mediterranean. Across Gaul and Britannia, into Africa and the East. Wherever the Romans buried their dead, Pluto stood at the edge of the grave. In mosaics, he is shown not in torment, but in majesty, seated crowned, serene, holding the cornucopia, flanked by Persephone not as prisoner, but as queen, their hands resting upon the earth, their eyes closed, listening, waiting. He had changed from Greek king to Roman patron, from Hades to Pluto. But the truth remained. He did not chase. He did not rule through terror. He ruled through return. And, even as the empire built roads that spanned continents, every stone laid, every milestone carved, brought its people one step closer to the god they would one day meet. In that, Pluto became the final citizen, the one no decree could overrule, the emperor beneath the empire. She began as a flower, a girl in the field, gathering blossoms in the light of spring. Kore, the maiden, daughter of Demeter, bright-eyed, untouched, the embodiment of life just before it begins. To the Greeks, she was youth, fertility, potential. She was the warm breeze, the green shoot, the hope before the harvest. But that was only half her name. The other half waited in the dark, Persephone, not a name given, a name taken, or chosen, or both. The myth told so many times always begins with a flower, the narcissus, the opening of the earth, the chariot, the scream, Hades takes her, and the world mourns. But that is not the end. It is not even the beginning, because Kore does not stay lost. She does not vanish into shadow. She becomes something else. She becomes Persephone. The Greeks knew that the earth must open for seeds to grow. That descent does not always mean defeat. In Eleusis, in Orphic rites, in the whispers of mothers and daughters, they told a different story, not of abduction, but of initiation. Kore went down into the underworld, yes, but she did not return. The same. She returned with eyes that had seen death and did not flinch. She returned not as a girl, but as a queen, no longer only the daughter of Demeter. She became the bride of Hades, but even that word, bride, is too narrow. She was his counterpart, not silent, not passive. Persephone ruled. When the judges passed sentence on the dead, she was present. When the gates opened to let souls pass through, it was with her consent. When Orpheus came singing, when Heracles came with strength, when Odysseus came seeking truth, it was Persephone who watched from beside the throne, and she did not weep. She weighed in this transformation. She became something greater than a myth. She became a symbol of cycles, of power, of return, and over time, her story grew. Poets began to see in her not just the victim of the underworld, but its balance. She was the only Olympian who lived in both worlds, light and dark, upper and lower, life and death. And so, she came to stand for the soul itself, for every human who must walk through joy and sorrow. She became the patron of transition, and women, especially, saw themselves in her. Girls married young in ancient Greece. Many were taken from the fields of their mothers' homes and thrust into new households. Just like Kore, they wept. Just like Demeter, but they adapted, they grew, they ruled. And in Persephone's story, they found strength, not because she fought, but because she endured, because she walked into darkness and made it a palace. In later eras, her image changed. The Romans saw her as Proserpina, more delicate perhaps, more tragic, but still divine, still sovereign. Her descent marked the harvest. Her return marked spring. And later still, Christian allegorists, despite rejecting the old gods, could not fully ignore her. They saw in her the echo of resurrection, a being who dies and returns, buried and risen. Persephone's myth lingered in the roots of later thought. She was Eve. She was Mary. She was the eternal feminine, caught between sin and grace. But the Greeks never saw her that way. She was not a warning, she was a truth, that life must pass through death, that the soul must ascend, that power can be quiet, and queens can wear crowns made not of gold, but of pomegranate, dark, bitter, red as blood, sweet as memory. The fruit she ate bound her to the underworld, but it also awakened her. It did not poison her, it crowned her, and for half the year, the world remembered. The winds grew colder, the days grew shorter, the fields fell quiet, and the name Persephone was whispered, not with fear, with respect, because the queen had returned to her throne, and the earth would wait, as it always had. When a soul died, it did not simply vanish, it traveled, down through the cracks of the world, past the rivers, past the gates, into silence. But not all silence was the same. There was a difference between the silence of grief and the silence of forgetting. The Greeks understood this. They believed that memory was not just a gift, it was a force, a tether, a weight. And in the land of the dead, memory had power. It could liberate the soul or imprison it. And at the center of that truth were two rivers. One was called Lethe. The other, Mnemosyne. Lethia, oblivion. Mnemosyne, remembrance. You drank from one to forget. You drank from the other to remember. Most souls, when they entered the underworld, were drawn to Lethia. They drank, they forgot. Their names blurred. Their deeds dissolved. Their pain and pleasure vanished into mist. And in that forgetting, they were freed, or so it seemed. Freed from the burdens of their former life. Freed from guilt. Freed from identity. But also freed from self. What is a soul without memory? What is the point of return, if you do not remember where you came from? This was the quiet cruelty of Let, not punishment, not pain, but loss. To drink from Lethe was to drift into the asphodel meadows, a gray plain, where the dead walked without purpose, not in torment, just empty. They did not cry. They did not sing. They were echoes, but not all drank. Some, the initiated, the Orphics, the wise, knew to seek the other, spring. Mnemosyne. It was hidden, guarded. Not everyone could find it, but those who did remembered their lives, their choices, their divine origin. The Orphics taught that the soul was a fallen star, that it had descended into flesh like a dream, and that only by remembering, truly remembering, could it ascend again. This was the secret path. This was the escape from rebirth, not through worship, not through sacrifice, through awareness, through the refusal to forget. And in that awareness, Hades watched, not judging, just waiting, because memory was the key. It held the truth of who the soul had been in, who it could still become. To forget was to remain, trapped. To remember was to be free. And so Hades' realm was not just filled with bones and shadows. It was filled with stories. The dead whispered them. The rivers carried them. The walls of the underworld pulsed with forgotten names, not lost, stored. Hades was their keeper, not just of the body, but of the soul's thread. He knew who you had been. He knew every oath you broke, every kindness you offered. Every time you chose silence when you should have spoken. And he kept it, not to torment, but to hold, because no soul could pass into its final place until the full weight of its memory was measured. This is why the Greeks feared forgetfulness, why they told stories, why they carved names in stone, why they recited the names of the dead before meals, because as long as someone remembered, the soul still lived, still mattered, still had shape. Hades did not erase, he preserved, and in that, he became more than death. He became the guardian of identity, of truth, of legacy. You could not bribe him. You could not lie to him. He did not punish falsehood. He simply saw it, and beneath that gaze, everything fell away except what was real. The soul, stripped of all its pretenses, stood before the memory of itself. Some broke under the weight, others rose, and when they did, Hades stepped aside, let them pass into judgment, into rebirth, or into the stars, because once you remember what you rule are no longer his. Hades did not rule alone. He had no army. He needed none, but his realm was not unguarded. It was filled with watchers, enforcers, keepers of boundaries. They were not gods in the sense of Olympus. They did not throw feasts, fall in love, or sculpt mortals from clay. They existed for one reason, to maintain the order of death, and each one embodied a principle, so fundamental that even the gods dared not challenge it. At the gate stood Cerberus, the hound of Hades. Not a metaphor, not a symbol of being. Flesh, bone, fury, 3 heads, a tail of serpents, eyes that had seen every soul since the dawn of man. Cerberus was not there to punish. He was not a hunter. He was a wall. He let all souls in, but none out. The living feared him. They should. He was not meant for them. Only a few ever passed him, and only by trickery or divine favor. Heracles wrestled him, barehanded. Orpheus lulled him with song. Aeneas drugged him with cake soaked in honey and opium, but even they did not defeat him. They slipped past, and he always returned, because Cerberus did not serve through loyalty. He served through law. That was the first layer of defense. Beyond him, on the banks of the Styx, or Acheron, stood Charon, the ferryman. Olel, gray, hollow. He did not smile. He did not speak. He reached out a hand and waited, the coin under the tongue, the toll. Without it, the soul could not cross. It would drift, linger, wail, not in pain, in unfinished ness. Charon did not decide who passed, he simply carried them. His boat was not powered by oars, but by fate, and his silence was a message. This is not a journey you direct, you only surrender to it. Then, further in, there were the judges, not gods, once mortal, but elevated through wisdom and legacy. Minos, the chief, once king of Crete, not warm, not cruel, just, precise, Rhadamanthus, stern, incorruptible. He judged the souls of the East, and all questions of divine law, Iocus, keeper of the keys, judge of Western souls, guardian of the gates. Together they heard every soul's story, not as told in words, but as carved into the soul's very being. There were no lies in the underworld. The soul carried its own evidence, and the judges were not executioners. They were mirrors. If you had lived with honor, with balance, you were sent to the asphodel meadows or, rarely, to Elysium. If you had poisoned the world, if you had broken sacred oaths, destroyed the innocent, or betrayed the gods, you were sent to Tartarus, but only after the judges agreed. Even then, your punishment was not arbitrary. It was poetic. Tantalus, forever reaching for food and water he could never grasp, because he fed his own son to the gods. Sisyphus, cursed to push a boulder endlessly, not because he was clever, but because he tried to outwit death itself. Ion, strapped to a burning wheel, not for murder, but for violating guest right and lusting after Hera herself. Tartarus was not hellfire, it was clarity, and each punishment told a story. Then there were the Furies, born of blood, older than the Olympians. They did not reside in the underworld, but they answered to it. When someone spilled kindred blood, when a brother killed a brother, or a son turned against father, the Furies rose. Not in vengeance, in balance. They chased the guilty across the world. They drove them mad. Not until they begged for punishment, but until they accepted it. Even Orestes, who killed his mother in revenge, found no peace until he was purified. The Furies did not judge, they reminded. They were memory personified. Hades did not command them, he simply did not stop them. Then, in the deeper halls, one might encounter other spirits, lesser guardians, silent attendants, shades who had served for so long they no longer remembered their names, wraiths who guided the newly dead, echoes of ancient priests, and in rare cases, Thanatos himself. Death, not a god of war, not a god of plague, a soft hand, a gentle touch. He came only when it was time, no sooner, no later. He did not kill, he escorted, and Hades trusted him, because Thanatos, like all things in this realm, followed the rules. No passion, no exception, just the quiet movement of the world, from one side to the other. This was the kingdom, not of screams, but of roles, of function, of meaning. Every guardian in the underworld represented a line that must not be crossed, not because it leads to pain, but because it leads to disorder, and Hades above all else was the god who kept things in place. Cerberus kept the gate, Charon kept the threshold, the judges kept the truth, the Furies kept the promise, and Death himself kept the schedule. There was no cruelty in this, only design, only necessity. The living often looked down on these guardians with fear, but the dead, they felt something else. They felt protected, because once you passed the threshold, you were no longer prey to the chaos of life. You were in the domain of the God who never forgot, and those who served him did not flinch, did not err, did not betray. They simply watched and waited. Before Hades, before Olympus, before even death had shaped, there was a pit. The Greeks called it Tartarus. It was not a metaphor, not a place for the sinful, not a cautionary tale whispered to children. Tartarus was real, a place, a presence, a boundary, and it existed not within the underworld but beneath it. Even Hades did not rule here. He acknowledged it, he respected it, but Tartarus belonged to something older, more primitive, more final. To reach it, one would have to fall for 9 days and 9 nights, not through air, not through stone, but through existence itself. The poet struggled to describe it, not because it was mysterious, but because it was absolute. Even chaos, the primordial void, came into being before Tartarus. It was one of the first beings, not born, simply there. The Titans feared it, the gods used it, but none controlled it. In the Titanomachy, the great war between the old gods and the new Tartarus became more than a place, it became a sentence. When Zeus and his siblings overthrew the Titans, they did not kill them, they cast them down. Kronos, once king of time, bound and hurled into the depths. IAPETUS, KRIOS, KOIOS, Hyperion, Hall. Imprisoned, not by chains alone, but by forgetting, in Tartarus. Time did not pass, pain did not pulse, only waiting endured. Their jailers were not men, not gods, but Briareus, Catus, and Gyges, the 100-handed ones, beings of monstrous form and infinite arms, born from Gaia and Uranus, once prisoners themselves, now keepers of the keys. Tartarus was not meant for mortals. Mortals did not fall so far, but in the oldest myths, a few found their way down. Sisyphus, the deceiver, rolled his stone up the incline of eternity. Tantalus, the betrayer of divine trust, reached for fruit that withered and water that fled. Ixion, the abuser of hospitality, spun on a burning wheel. Forever. Their punishments were not fire, they were reflections. Tartarus was not a furnace. It was a mirror that never stopped showing what you had done. And yet, even these torments were reserved only for the unforgivable. The Titans did not suffer punishment as we understand it. They simply were bound, silenced, cut off from cosmos, and that was enough. Tartarus became the cosmic garbage pit, not of filth, but of broken laws. Zeus used it not as cruelty but as containment. He could not destroy the Titans. They were too old, too fundamental, so he buried them beneath the world they once ruled, where they could watch, but never act, where their memories echoed but reached no ears. Tartarus was not designed to teach a lesson. It was built to isolate power too, dangerous to erase, and still, it called in myth. Mortals were warned, do not summon what lies beneath. Do not imitate Prometheus. Do not dare to reshape the cosmic order. For Tartarus waits, not out of vengeance, but balance. Even the gods were not above it. It was said that Zeus himself feared it, that he glanced toward its edge only once, and never again. Tartarus did not tempt, it did not whisper, it did not offer it. It refused escape, refused redemption, refused motion. It was not a dungeon, it was a concept-made place, a place where the cosmic law had to store that which had no place elsewhere. And Hades, Lord of the Dead, did not interfere. He did not open its doors, he did not check its locks, he simply let it exist. Tartarus was beneath, even him. It answered to something older. It was where the old world went to sleep, where rebellion goes to rot, where broken gods go when their time has ended. It did not destroy, it did not judge, it simply held, forever. Most myths are about heroes, kings, warriors, gods, men who sailed seas, women who defied Olympus, beasts that fell under blades. The stories burn bright, loud, spectacular. But beneath that noise, something else moved, something quieter, something closer. It wasn't the thunder of Zeus or the wrath of Poseidon. It was the soft, unrelenting approach of Hades. He was not just the end of kings, he was the end of bakers, of children, of mothers who passed in childbirth, of farmers who fell in the field, of the unnamed. He ruled not over the dramatic, but over the universal, and in that, he was present in the lives of every Greek, always near, always watching, always waiting, but he was rarely mentioned. The Greeks were cautious. They did not speak his name aloud unless they had to. When they did, they used softened titles: Ubilus, good counsel; Plauton, the wealthy one. They poured libations to him at night, in silence, eyes averted. They left offerings at grave markers, not on temple steps. They did not invite his presence, but they respected it, because he was not a god to be summoned. He arrived on his own, the moment you were born. He was there waiting, patiently, at the other side of your life, no matter how far you traveled, how high you climbed, how long you lived. You would see him again, not in malice, just in truth. He had no need for worship, in the grand sense. He did not ask for festivals or glory, but his presence was everywhere, in funeral rites, in dreams, in the quiet dread that crept in during sickness, war, famine, and in the sudden silences no one could explain. Even the hearth, sacred to Hestia, knew its warmth would one day fade. Even Aphrodite's love stories ended in funerals. Even Ares, drenched in blood, could not strike without Hades watching from the distance. In the daily life of the Greeks, death was a neighbor. The dead were not forgotten. They were invited, spoken of, revered. The living left food on graves. They lit lamps. They touched the marble and whispered names. In this way, they didn't just honor their ancestors. They kept the attention of Hades gentle, because to forget the dead was to disrupt the order. And Hades ruled over order. When a loved one died, the body was washed, wrapped, wept over, the mouth closed, the eyes shut, the coin placed carefully beneath the tongue, not as superstition, as necessity, because the soul could not cross without it, and Hades, through Charon, would not bend the rule. The soul would wander otherwise, tethered to the world like a broken kite, not tormented, not tortured, just incomplete. Even the architecture of Greek cities reflected his shadow. Tombs lined the roads outside the walls, not hidden, not shunned, integrated. You passed them on your way to market. Children played near them. Names worn by wind and rain still whispered legacies, and above it all, the understanding lingered that life was brief, but memory could be long. And in that memory, Hades took shape not as a figure with horns, but as a presence in the air. The coolness that enters a room when someone important leaves it. The hush that follows final words. The Greeks read omens carefully. A dream of descending stairs, a sudden gust extinguishing a candle, a crow perched on a windowsill, a strange silence. In the woods. Not all signs were divine, but some belonged to him, and when they came, the people responded not with panic, but with respect. They consulted oracles. They left extra offerings. They asked Hermes for guidance, because when Hades stirred, it meant something had shifted. Something inevitable was approaching. He did not stalk. He invited. Even in plague, his touch was impersonal. He did not choose victims. He received them. He did not sow suffering. He gathered it, and always, without fail. He held it gently, completely, without opinion, without exception. This is what made him different. Other gods demanded emotional love, loyalty, fear. Hades required only one thing, that you understood your place, not as punishment, as perspective. No matter how small you were, your name would one day pass through his realm, and if you were remembered, if your rights were honored, if your story was told, you would be more than ash. You would be a presence, a part of the great balance he kept between forgetting and eternity. The underworld was not chaos. It was a system, a landscape woven from law, myth, fear, and memory. A place that began the moment you died, but did not end with your arrival. To enter Hades' realm was not to disappear. It was to travel, and the journey had structure, physical, as mortals measure it, but symbolic. First came the entrance, not one, but many. Some said it opened through the cave at Tanarum, the mouth of the world in southern Greece. Others pointed to Lake Avernus, a stinking volcanic basin in Italy. Others still found the entrance in dreams in the sudden cold, the yawning stares behind the eyes. But wherever it began, it always began with darkness, not night, something deeper. The light of the mortal world faded, and the soul entered a place where space folded, sound thinned, the pulse of time slowed. This was the threshold, the place between worlds. And then came the rivers. The Greeks described 5, each not merely water, but experience. The first and most sacred, Styx, black, unbreakable, encircling the underworld 7 times. Even the gods swore oaths upon it. To lie on Styx was to invite obliteration. If a god broke such an oath, they were cast out of Olympus for 10 years, mute, breathless, exiled. Styx was not wrath, Styx was binding. Then came Acheron, the river of pain. This was where Charon waited. Souls gathered along its banks, like mist. In a valley. They did not scream, they waited. Some carried their obols, others did not. The coin granted passage. Without it, the soul wandered, unheard, unseen, untouched. Pain, in this river, was not punishment. It was separation. Next flowed Lethia, the river of forgetfulness. Those who drank from it forgot everything, their names, their sins, their dreams. Lethia was not cruel. It was mercy, but also erasure. It lulled the soul into nothingness, not agony, but absence. Then there was Phlegethon, the river of fire. It burned, but not to torture. Its flames were pure, cleansing. It curled around the walls of Tartarus, guarding what should never be touched. Its fire was not destruction, it was containment. Last, Cocytus, the river of wailing, cold, mournful, for the unburied, the forgotten, the cursed. It whispered with the voices of souls who had never been named aloud. Their grief froze the water. It was not rage, that it was reminder. These rivers did not divide the underworld. They shaped it. They told the soul where it belonged. Once the soul crossed, Acheron usually ferried by Charon. If the rites had been observed, it passed the gates. These were guarded by Cerberus, the 3-headed hound. He did not judge. He did not sniff for evil. He simply obeyed the law. All may enter, none may leave, and beyond him, the terrain unfolded. The first region was Asphodel Meadows, a gray plain, neither joyful nor painful. Here wandered the souls of the ordinary farmers, sailors, servants, mothers. Their lives had been quiet, their deaths unremarkable. Not bad, not great, just human. In Asphodel, they drifted, not in torment, in stillness, a place of echoes of wind without direction. Not cruel, not warm. The sound of a name you almost remember. Then came Elysium, the Elysian. Fields, fields of gold. Not reserved for wealth or status, but virtue. Here dwelled the heroes, the poets, the philosophers who had lived in balance. They were not rewarded with endless pleasure, but with presence, clarity, rest, and those who lived 3 such lives in sequence. They were allowed to dwell in the Isles of the Blessed, a paradise beyond rebirth, perfection beneath the earth. But far below all these was Tartarus, not just deep but separate, guarded by the flames of Phlegethon. Its walls held the Titans. Its skies echoed with the cries of those whose souls judged beyond redemption. Not most, not many, only those who had unmade the fabric of life. Those who had betrayed divinity itself. And yet even Tartarus had boundaries. The soul could not fall into it by mistake. It was sentenced there by the judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Iolcus. They sat near the pillars of judgment, silent, ancient, never moved by bribe or plea. The soul stood naked before them, not physically, spiritually. Its entire being laid bare. No lies, no stories, just truth. And if the soul had done no great evil, but also no great good, to Asphodel it went. And so the underworld was not a place of punishment. It was a place of placement. Every corner of it told the soul, this is who you are, not who you pretended to be, who you became. Even the terrain followed that logic. The further you descended, the more irreversible things became. At the outer edges, there were gates still open, but the deeper in you traveled, the heavier the doors grew. Until they no longer opened, until even memory couldn't pass through. That is where Hades sat, at the deepest point, where choice no longer lived, where only truth remained. He did not walk the fields, he did not row the rivers. He watched, he kept the map, and the map was drawn from more than geography. It was drawn from justice, and justice in his realm was not about reward or revenge. It was about belonging. There were 3 of them. No one knew their origin, not even the gods. They were not daughters of Zeus. They did not dwell on Olympus. They were older, older than the sky, older than death, older than death, older, even, than chaos. The Greeks called them the Moirai, the Fates. Clotho spun the thread. Lachesis measured it. Atropos cut. Together, they ruled all life, and not even Hades, king of the dead, ruler of the invisible, could touch their work. They existed beyond him. They decided when he would receive a soul, not why, not how. When. The moment they cut the thread, the soul was his, and never a second before. This was the one thing Hades did not control. He enforced laws, guarded gates, judged the dead, but the Moirai held the scissor. In his realm, their presence was not loud, but it was absolute. Every soul that arrived had been cut by their hand. They spun at birth, measured through life, cut at death. The thread was the soul's timeline, fragile, golden, gleaming. Even gods had threads, even Zeus, even Hades himself. This was the law beneath all laws, and that is why Hades never rebelled, why he never reached upward, never challenged Olympus, never interfered with mortal time, because he understood, more than Zeus, more than Poseidon, Hades knew his place. He did not fear the fates, he honored them. Every time a soul entered his realm, he saw their handiwork, the way Clotho had spun the moment of their first breath, the way Lachesis had measured their choices, their time, their turning points, and how Atropos, without pause, had ended it. There was no mercy in their work, but there was no malice, either, only balance. It was Atropos who made his realm necessary. If she never cut, Hades would have no kingdom, and so he waited not with hunger, but with patience. Every day he received what was due, no more, no less, and he never questioned it. Even the judges of the dead Minos Rhadamanthus, Iolcus passed verdicts only after the Moirai had acted. Their decisions were not to prevent fate, but to interpret what had happened within it. The fates did not reside in the underworld. They did not live on Olympus. They spun in a space beyond time, yet their threads ran through everything, even dreams, even prophecy. Oracles glimpsed the thread, but only briefly, and even then, they could not stop it. In tragedy, mortals tried. Oedipus ran from the thread that was spun for him, and met it head-on. Achilles knew his thread was short and chose glory over length. The Greeks never saw death as a mistake. They saw it as a return to the pattern. And Hades, he was the one who received a thread once it was cut. He did not judge the fates. He obeyed them. He did not call them servants. He called them sisters. And when a soul protested, "It's too soon, I wasn't ready, it's not fair," he said nothing, because he knew. He had seen the cut. He had read the line. He had held the thread in his hand, still warm, still trembling, and he knew. It had ended. He accepted what even gods struggled with, that all things end, not as cruelty, not as punishment, as structure, as design. Even in the Orphic rites, where the soul sought release from the cycle of rebirth, the fates remained. The soul might escape the body, but only by understanding the thread, only by remembering, only by waking up within the weave. This is why the fates were feared and revered, because their power could not be bribed, could not be prayed away, could not be stopped. And Hades, in his silence, mirrored them. He did not spin, he did not measure, he did not cut, but he stood beneath the loom, and when the golden thread dropped, still glowing, still humming with a lifetime of choices, he caught it, he cradled it, he placed it in the vault of memory, and another space was made in his kingdom. No matter how long or short the life had been, it belonged, because the fates had written it, and Hades would never erase it. He was the god of all endings, and yet, he is the god we see the least, in temples and sculpture, on vases and coins. The gods of Olympus are everywhere: Zeus, thunderbolt raised; Athena, with helmet and spear; Apollo, lyre in hand, radiant in marble. But Hades, he is often absent, or half seen, or hidden, and that absence is not a mistake. It is design, it is intentional. The Greeks did not depict Hades the way they did the others, not because they feared his appearance, but because they respected his domain too. Summon his image was to invite him, to name him in art, was to bring him forward, and he was never meant to walk among the living. Even his statues are rare, but when he does appear, when the Greeks did dare to carve or paint him, Hades appears in a way no other god does, not shining, not blazing, still seated on a throne, dark hair, bearded grave, a crown, simple and unadorned. Sometimes he holds a scepter long, heavy, a mark of permanence, sometimes a bident, not the trident of Poseidon, but a tool of division. 2 points, 2 paths, 2 outcomes, judgment and balance. Rarely, he holds the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. It overflows with grain, fruit, gold, a reminder that everything fertile comes from beneath, that the wealth of the world lies, buried both, treasure and bone. His throne is not gold, it is stone, massive, carved, set, deep within shadow. He does not stand, he receives, he does not chase, he waits. In many depictions he is shown with Persephone. Beside him, they are not romanticized, they do not hold hands. They sit together, equal. She may hold a torch, he may rest a hand upon Cerberus, seated at his feet. Cerberus too is not snarling, he is alert, 3 heads, each watching a different direction, past, present, future, sometimes. Hades is shown with his helm of invisibility, a gift from the Cyclopes, worn not to hide in shame, to act without spectacle, even in battle. During the Titanomachi, Hades did not call thunder or waves, he moved unseen, he acted in silence. The Greeks depicted him the same way. His power was not in grandeur, it was in inevitability, and yet, when Romans adopted him, renamed him Pluto, they dared more. In mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures, Pluto appears with more color, more warmth, not joyful, not cruel, but complete. He holds Persephone's hand, he leads her from the earth, or welcomes her back. They ride together in the chariot that first brought her to the underworld. There is sorrow in these images, but also sovereignty. The Romans softened him. They made him into a patron of wealth, of land, of the cycle of seasons. Still, they did not mock him. They understood. In sarcophagi, Hades appears at the foot of the dying, not as a grim reaper, but as a host, a quiet presence, a transition in funeral art. His presence is implied more often than shown. The gates, the river, the coin, a dark figure at the edge of the panel, head bowed, hand outstretched, no force, no rage, just the truth. Even in pottery, when scenes of the underworld were painted, Hades is not the centerpiece, he is the axis, the background that holds the story upright. A quiet throne in the corner, a single gesture, A glance, and that was enough. The Greeks believed you did not need to see Hades to understand him. In fact, seeing too much would undo the mystery. So, they painted around him, spoke beside him, wrote his name, less often than any other god, even in the great temples. There were few dedicated solely to him, and when there were, like the mysterious temple at Elis, or the shrine at Eleusis, they were underground, hidden, opened only once a year, because Hades did not live in light, and yet he was never absent. He is in the shadows behind the lyre of Orpheus, in the lowered gaze of Persia, in the line of coins pressed into the mouths of the dead. He does not need to be shown to be present, because every tomb is a statue, every grave is his altar, every whisper of remembrance is his hymn. That is his art, that is his icon, not in bronze, not in paint, but in the silence between heartbeats and the stone beneath your feet. To the poets, Hades was a king. To the common people, he was the gatekeeper of death, but to the philosophers he was truth unvarnished, inevitable, and necessary. The first to truly challenge the surface myths was Pythagoras. To him, the soul was not a singular journey, but a cycle. Life was one thread of a much longer pattern. Death was not an end, that was a transition. And Hades, he was not a jailer, he was a station master, a guardian of the crossing. When the body perished, the soul descended, not for punishment, but for cleansing, for reckoning, for remembrance. Pythagoras taught that all beings carried within them the residue of past lives, that each incarnation was a step toward purification or corruption. The underworld, in this view, was where the soul paused, where it weighed its own story before being reborn. It was not myth, it was geometry of the spirit. He saw the rivers of Hades as symbolic forces: Acheron sorrow, Lithophore, getting Phlegethon desire, Cocytus grief, and Styx binding. Each river was a trial. Each soul must pass through them, not to be judged, but to understand its own imbalance. Then came Plato in his dialogues. He preserved the myth of Hades, but used it to speak about justice in the Republic. He tells the tale of a soldier who dies on the battlefield and returns to life after 12 days. Describes a vision, souls being judged, then sent either upward to reward or downward to pay their debts. After 1,000 years, they return to choose a new life. The key, the choice. Even in the afterlife, Plato believed, the soul was free. It bore responsibility, and Hades was the mirror, the place where illusion was stripped away, and only truth remained. The underworld was not a place of fire and torment. It was a school, a domain of reflection, where the soul saw itself without distortion, where it stood before the judges not to be condemned, but to be revealed. Plato emphasized memory. The worst fate was not pain, it was forgetting the river Lethia. To him was not mercy, it was danger. For to drink deeply meant to lose the lessons of 1,000 lives, and so he introduced another Riveni Messini, memory. In later Orphic traditions, souls were taught not to drink from Lethia, but from Mnemosyne, so they would remember, so they would awaken, so they would ascend. And Hades, he did not prevent this, he did not interfere, he watched, he guided, he ensured the souls reached the right gate. He maintained the order, not out of tyranny, but out of duty. Then came the Neoplatonists, Plotinus, Proclus, Porphyry. To them, Hades was not even a being. He was a principle, a metaphysical force, the embodiment of return. The soul, they argued, was a fragment of the divine. The one, when it descended into the world, it forgot. It was tangled in matter, illusion, sensation. Death was the unraveling. The path back, and the underworld was the interface, the veil between illusion and essence. In this model, Hades became less of a character and more of a threshold, a spiritual law. Just as gravity binds matter, Hades bound souls not to punish, but to bring them back to origin. And yet, The personal aspect never vanished. Even in the most abstract philosophies, the image of Hades remained, still watching, holding a god who did not strike, but received, who did not rage, but recorded, because even the wisest minds, when speaking of the soul, found comfort in the idea that something stood at the boundary, not to stop you, but to witness you, fully, completely, and in that witnessing, you became more than dust, you became part of the eternal pattern, a moment in the infinite breath of existence. Even now, philosophers reference Hades not as the devil, but as necessity, entropy, structure. Death, not as a tragedy, but as a function, a law without judgment, a king without ambition, a god who ruled not with fire, but with gravity, because all things fall, and all things end, and all things return. He was never evil. Not in the beginning. The Greeks knew that. They did not love him, but they never blamed him. Hades was not the source of suffering, he was the steward of its end. He did not cause death. He simply waited for it. But something happened, something shifted. Not quickly, not with fire, but with language. And over time, the god who ruled in silence became a monster, spoken in fear. It began with the Romans. When they absorbed Greek culture, they renamed the gods. Zeus became Jupiter. Athena became Minerva. Hades became Pluto. At first, the change was mild. Pluto came from Plautus, meaning wealth. The Romans saw him not only as the lord of the dead, but as the god of underground riches, gold, silver, precious stone. He was not feared, but respected. He kept the cycle turning. Farmers made offerings to him before planting. Miners carved his symbols near tunnels. He was dark, yes, but he was necessary, still. Even in Rome. Something began to fade. The philosophical depth of the Greek underworld became theatrical. The mysteries were simplified. The soul's journey became a story, not a structure. And then came the most profound shift. Christianity, anew. Theology, anew. Cosmology, one God, one afterlife, one devil. And they needed a place for him. They called it hell. A place of torment, of fire, punishment, eternal suffering. And they reached, perhaps without full awareness, for a name that had been buried for centuries. Hades, not as a god, as a place. This is where the confusion deepened. The name Hades, which had once referred to both the god and the realm, became twisted. No longer the destination of all souls, as in Greek tradition, but the home of the damned, no longer ruled by a just and silent king, but by a horned tyrant. And this tyrant, he wasn't called Hades anymore. He was now called Satan. And yet, echoes remained. In the Latin Vulgate, the Bible translated the Greek word Hades into not Gehenna, not Tartarus, but Hades. From this single stroke, centuries of myth were flattened. The god became the place became punishment, and the punishment became eternal. Art changed to where, once Hades had been depicted as grave. Composed, seated in stone, he was now drawn with flames licking at his feet. Red skin, twisted horns, forked tail. The bident became a trident. The throne became a pit. His role was no longer to judge with patience, but to torment with relish, and slowly. The idea of Hades as a fair ruler of death was lost, forgotten. His silence was mistaken for cruelty. His distance was mistaken for apathy. His kingdom, once a landscape of memory, cleansing and return, was reduced to hellfire. And yet, the truth remained, buried beneath doctrine, waiting in texts too obscure for priests to quote, in statues too old to fully erase. In myths too deep to burn. Because even as the Middle Ages painted him red, even as Dante carved hell into 9 screaming circles, even as sermons turned his name into a hiss, there were always those who remembered the original, the Orpheus, the Neoplatonists, the esoteric philosophers of the Renaissance. They whispered the older truth, that death was not a punishment, that the soul was not damned, that Hades was not a devil. He was balance, he was stillness, he was the last hand to hold you. He did not chase, he did not lie, he did not burn. He watched, he measured, and he never forgot. In secret societies and forbidden texts, his image was reclaimed. A dark god, but not an evil one, a necessary god, a god of endings that allowed beginnings. And in the modern day, as paganism rises once more, as scholars untangle the knots of ancient myth, his name is spoken again, not in sermons, in remembrance, Hades, not hell, not Satan, not rage, just the Shadow King, the god of the resting. And perhaps, one day, the world will remember, not the mask that was forced upon him, but the face he truly wore, calm, unchanging, and just. They gathered in silence, at night, by torchlight. For 9 days, they fasted, walked, bathed, recited sacred hymns. They carried sacred objects, and they spoke of death as if it were a door. These were not common rituals. They were not sacrifices to gain favor or avoid punishment. They were mysteries. The most sacred rites of the ancient world. Eleusis, humble town just outside Athens, held a secret older than empire, older than Homer, older even than the temples of Olympus. At the heart of it, 2 goddesses, Demeter, mother of grain, and Persephone, the daughter stolen away. But behind their story, watching silently, stood a third figure, Hades. And while he was never the one who spoke in the mysteries, his presence filled the silence between every chant. He was the axis, the hidden truth. The mysteries were built on loss. Demeter's despair at the disappearance of Persephone, her wandering, cloaked as a mortal, the death of harvest, the refusal to allow life to continue, and then Persephone's return, but not fully, because she had eaten from the underworld. A pomegranate seed, red, bursting with meaning. This bound her, not to torment, to truth. She would spend part of the year above with her mother, and part below with her husband. This was not punishment. It was the cycle. The mysteries taught that what seemed like tragedy was, in truth, transformation. That descent was not the end of life, but the beginning of something deeper. Participants were sworn to secrecy. Their teachings have never been fully written down, but ancient writers left hints. Plato said that those initiated into the mysteries would not fear death. Cicero called it the greatest gift Greece had given the world. In the sacred rites, initiates experienced a symbolic death and rebirth. They walked in darkness. They heard sacred words, and they emerged changed, not through ecstasy, through understanding. And Hades, he was there not on the altar, but in the structure, because it was his kingdom that Persephone entered. It was in his halls that she became queen, not captive, not victim, but sovereign. In the mysteries, Persephone is not a girl, she is a goddess of 2 worlds. And Hades is not her jailer. He is the god who grants her the right to rule. They are not lovers in the modern sense, but they are partners in the rhythm of life and death. Without Hades, the cycle cannot turn. Without Persephone, it cannot bloom. The rituals of Eleusis taught the soul to embrace this, to see beyond fear, to witness death not as punishment, but as passage. The rites were not about escaping the underworld. They were about preparing for it, recognizing it, honoring it. And when the final ceremony arrived, inside the Telesterion, the great hall of initiation, those who had passed every trial stood in silence. What they saw is still unknown. No initiate ever spoke of it, but every account agrees. They left changed. Some wept, some laughed. All understood. And Hades, he did not appear, but his hand was in everything. The grain that was sown, the seed that split, the child that vanished, the goddess that returned. The meaning was not in avoiding death, it was in living through it, in seeing that descent does not mean destruction, that the shadow does not erase the light that defines it to the initiated. Hades was not the villain of Persephone's myth. He was the necessity, the balance, the one who took her. Yes, but not to keep her, to awaken her, to transform her. And in that transformation, she became more than daughter. She became dual, the maiden, and the queen, spring and winter life, and afterlife, and Hades. He did not demand worship. He did not seek praise. He simply waited for the soul to stop fearing him and start understanding the Eleusinian mysteries. Lasted nearly 2,000 years. Empires rose and fell. Philosophies clashed. Gods changed names. But the mysteries endured until Christianity rose, and with it, a new fear of death. The rites were outlawed, the temple burned, and the silence returned. But still, beneath the soil of Eleusis, the whispers remain, of torches, of hymns, of a god who ruled not with wrath but with meaning, and of a queen who chose, again and again, to return. He never leaves the underworld. He does not rise like Zeus, does not crash like Poseidon, does not roam like Hermes. Hades stays, and in doing so, he becomes something more than myth. He becomes symbol to the modern mind. Stripped of temples and hymns, the gods still remain, not as beings in the sky, but as archetypes, deep structures in the human mind. And no god embodies this descent more than Hades. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of the self we refuse to see, the unspoken dot, the repressed, the avoided. It is fear, it is grief, it is the wound that festers because it is buried. And Hades, he is that burial made conscious. He is the king of the things we do not speak of, the ruler of what we call unacceptable. But here's the truth. He is not evil. He is not chaos. He is order in silence. What Jung understood and what the ancients symbolized without words is that healing does not happen in sunlight alone. It happens in the dark, when you stop running from the wound, when you sit beside it, when you enter the place within yourself that you fear most, and find it is ruled not by a monster, but by a quiet God who already knows your name. Hades is that figure. He is not the trauma. He is the holder of it. He does not cause the pain. He is the one who says, "You may bring it here, and it will not consume you." In dreams, Hades is the cave dot, the forgotten memory, the face we glimpse behind our own. He is the father we buried, the truth we ignored, the voice we silenced. But when we meet him not as an enemy, but as a guide, something shifts. Because Hades does not punish, he reveals. And what he reveals is what we've always carried. The shadow is not the enemy, it is the map. Joseph Campbell, too, saw this dot in his hero's journey. Every mythic path leads down. The descent into the abyss, the belly of the whale, the dark night of the soul. And in that place waits not a devil, but a guardian, a gatekeeper, a Hades. Every hero must meet him, not to destroy him, to accept him. Because the treasure we seek is never in the light, it is in the cave we fear to enter. In psychology, this is more than metaphor, it is process. Therapy is the path to Hades. Meditation is the descent to Hades. Confronting your grief, your guilt, your shame, these are the rituals of Eleusis, rewritten in neural pathways and breath. And just like the ancient mysteries, there is no shortcut. You must go down. You must see what you've hidden. You must speak to the king. And what does he say? He says, "This too is part of you." He does not ask for worship. He asks for honesty. The underworld is not separate from the world. It is the foundation of it. Just as roots grow in soil, the soul grows in shadow, and the one who tends it, who keeps it sacred, who never leaves, that is Hades. He is the therapist who does not interrupt, the memory that returns in stillness, the cry that finally escapes in solitude. The world fears the unconscious, fears the breakdown, fears depression, grief, collapse. But these are not deaths. They Rinitions. In the myth of Persephone, she is dragged down but emerges transformed. This is not a story of victimhood, it is a story of descent and return. And in the center of that spiral stands Hades, not as a villain, but as the only god who witnesses you fully. Zeus rules the sky, Poseidon rules the sea. Hades rules everything you carry inside. And in our modern world, that makes him more relevant than ever, because we are taught to perform, to smile, to ascend. But the truth is, every human will descend, and the quality of that descent, whether it breaks us or remakes us, depends on whether we face Hades with fear or with reverence. He is the god who never leaves, because the soul is not something you can leave behind. You carry it, and he carries you. When you mourn, you speak his name without knowing. When you dream of the one you lost, he is there. When you finally stop running and sit in silence with your grief, he is there, not as the end, but as the beginning after the end. He was called many things, but rarely was he called by his name. Hades, from AIDS, meaning the unseen one, was already a title, not a birth name. It was a veil, a barrier between what was spoken and what was meant. In ancient Greece, the power of naming was sacred. To speak the true name of a god was to invoke them, to summon their essence into the room. And for a god like Hades, who ruled the most sacred of all, boundaries, life and death, that power was treated with reverence, or fear. So they called him other things. They gave him epithets, titles, masks, not to deceive, but to survive the speaking. Each name was a window, a fragment of the truth. Together, they revealed the Shadow King in his fullest form. The most common of these was Plauton, derived from Ploutos-wealth. To call him Plauton was to emphasize that from the earth came all riches, grain, gold, oil, silver, all buried things, all precious things, even the dead. In this form, he was not feared, but honored. Offerings were made to Plauton for fertile harvests. He was sometimes shown holding a cornucopia, overflowing with fruit, and grain. Plauton was Hades gentled, made noble, made generous. But it was still him. Then there was Ubulus. This name meant good counsel. It appeared most often in the Eleusinian mysteries. Why? Because in those rites, Hades was not the villain. He was the initiator, the one who guides the soul to wisdom through descent. As Ubulus, Hades was the silent teacher, not of information but of transformation. He did not speak loudly, but what he revealed could not be forgotten. Another name was Cerberus. This name is more obscure. It appears in Orphic hymns, a child god, a hunter, a king of the dead before Hades, or perhaps an aspect of Hades himself in a more primordial form. Cerberus was born, devoured, and reborn. He represented the cycle not just of life and death but of spiritual fragmentation and reintegration. Some traditions merged Cerberus with Dionysus, two gods of madness and rebirth, two gods who died and returned. But in Cerberus, we glimpse the wild side of Hades, not the seated king, but the dismembered soul. The scream in the underworld before the silence returned. Another rare epithet, Chthonios, the one from beneath. This was not unique to Hades. Other gods, Hermes, Zeus, even Demeter, had chthonic aspects. But when Hades was called Chthonios, it meant he was being invoked, not as a ruler, but as an element, a presence in the soil, a force in the roots, a breath under stone. This was Hades, not as a person, but as gravity, as inevitability, as the pull that takes all things down. There was also Aidoneus. This is simply another linguistic form of Hades, but in some myths, Aidoneus becomes almost a separate figure. He appears not as a god, but as a mortal king of the underworld, suggesting a tradition so ancient it predates the Olympians. In these versions, he marries Persephone, not by abduction, but by alliance. He rules a realm that is not hell but a mirror of the world above. Adonis was human-shaped death, a man with a crown and a dark throne, not evil, just final. And then there were names, not meant to be spoken at all. Polydectes, the receiver of many, Polyxenos host, too many strangers. These names reminded the Greeks of a simple, eternal truth. Everyone, one day, would be his guest. Hades was the ultimate host, the final king, and his palace knew no shortage of arrivals. Each of these titles carried not just description, but ritual significance. In prayers, people used these names as offerings of respect, as shields, as a way of saying, I know who you are, I honor you, please, pass me by. Because even when they feared him, they never denied him. They understood that death was not cruel, it was simply present, always. Even the euphemisms told the story. People did not say he died, they said, he went to Hades, or, he journeyed to the house of many. They said, he was taken by the unseen, not to erase grief, but to mark it properly, to frame it in language older than pain, because naming Hades was never about magic, it was about truth, the truth that every joy ends, that every song falls silent, that every flame burns low, and yet through that ending, something else may begin, a harvest, a memory, a rebirth. This was the wisdom of his epithets, not to avoid him, but to know him in all his shapes, as king, as counselor, as shadow, as soil, as wealth, as silence, and to accept fully that all these are part of life and therefore part of you. He rarely speaks, he rarely moves, and yet, in the great stories of Greek mythology, the moment a hero approaches the edge of death, Hades is already there, not to stop them, but to observe. He is the test no one mentions, the guardian no one defeats, because even when he is silent, he defines the stakes. Let us begin with Heracles, the strongest of mortals, favored by Zeus, cursed by Hera, driven mad and sentenced to 12 impossible labors, the 12th, to descend into the underworld itself, to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, not to kill him, not to chain him, to lead him out, unharmed, into the light. This was no feat of muscle, it was a journey of respect. Heracles did not storm the gates, he asked permission. He approached Hades with reverence, and Hades, unlike the gods of Olympus, granted him an audience. He agreed, because Heracles did not defy death, he honored it. He returned Cerberus without injury, proving not dominance over death, but understanding of it. And so Heracles earned, not just glory, but a kind of initiation. He was one of the few who descended and returned transformed. Then there is Orpheus, the poet, the singer, the one whose lyre could move trees and beasts, whose voice could stop rivers. When his beloved Eurydice died, he did not accept it. He descended. He walked the long cold road into Hades' realm, and he sang. He sang of love, of loss, of aching hope. He sang not to overpower Hades, but to awaken. Mercy. And Hades, for a moment, relented. He allowed Eurydice to return on one condition. Orpheus must not look back. He must trust. But Orpheus doubted, and in that moment of fear, he turned, and she vanished. Not because Hades was cruel, because law is law. Hades is not swayed by emotion, only by truth. Orpheus failed not because he was unworthy, but because he could not release control. Death cannot be commanded, it can only be respected. Then there is Sisyphus, the clever king, the trickster, the one who cheated death not once, but twice. He chained Thanatos, the god of death. He escaped Hades' realm on a false promise. He thought himself smarter than the underworld, but Hades does not forget. And when Sisyphus finally died, truly and permanently, Hades imposed not a punishment of fire but a futility, a stone, an endless task, not to torture, to teach. Sisyphus' punishment is not pain, it is meaninglessness, because the worst fate is not death, it is to live without purpose, without end, without change. And Hades, god of endings, is the antidote to that. He is not torment, he is closure. Even Theseus, slayer of the Minotaur, crosses into Hades' realm. With Pirithers, he descends to steal Persephone for himself. A foolish act, hubris, beyond reason. And Hades, he does not rage, he simply invites them to sit, and they cannot rise. They are frozen, rooted, held by the very ground, because in Hades' kingdom, willpower means nothing without wisdom. Theseus is eventually freed barely. Pirithers never leaves. The lesson is clear. You do not take from the dead. You do not steal from the soil. Even Odysseus, the wily hero of the Odyssey, makes the journey. He does not meet Hades directly, but walks the fringes of the realm. He speaks to the dead, to his mother, to fallen comrades, to the prophet, Tiriesias. Each voice gives him knowledge, direction, because death is not just an ending, it is clarity. The underworld is the place where masks fall away, and in that, Hades becomes not a jailer, but Revealer. In every myth, he is the gate, and the gate is not guarded with swords, it is guarded with rules, unbreakable, unbending, eternal. The moment a soul crosses, they are subject not to judgment, but to structure. You are what you chose. You live with what you did. There is no deception in Hades' realm, only truth. He appears again in the myth of Persephone, not just as husband, but as initiator. In Myth tale, he shows the boundary between loyalty and temptation. In Asclepius' myth, he demands that the healer not resurrect the dead without permission, because death, once given, is sacred. Hades is not the villain in these tales. He is the one who reminds the living that their actions echo forever. Even in myths where he never speaks, he defines the world. He is the edge of the map, the wall behind the throne, the final silence, after the last scream. Because, in all stories, the greatest fear is not the monster, it is the ending, and Hades rules that ending, not with fire, with stone, with law, with time, with stillness. And every hero who meets him learns the same thing. You cannot escape death, but you can choose how you face it, and in doing so you reveal who you truly are. He did not rule alone. Hades, the king who never left his realm, commanded no armies, issued no proclamations, demanded no temples on earth, but his kingdom moved like a clock, and every cog in its silence had a name. They were not warriors, they were not angels, they were functions, necessary, terrible, sacred, first. Among them was Thanatos, death himself, not war, not disease, not accident. Thanatos was gentle death, the moment of the last breath, when the soul slips from the body like steam from a flame. He is not cruel, he is not emotional, he does not choose when or how, he simply arrives. In Hesiod, Thanatos is described as pitiless and strong. In Euripides, he is robed in black, cold as night, but fair. He walks alone, no words, no mercy, just duty. Even the gods rarely interfere with him, for what god would dare unweave the thread of life itself? Only once was Thanatos tricked by Sisyphus, who chained him in his own cellar. But the world paid a price. With Thanatos bound, no one could die, not the old, not the wounded, not the sick, and deathlessness became horror. Eventually, Ares released him. Because even war requires death to function. Without Thanatos, there is no peace, no ending, only decay. Then there were the Erinyes, called the Furies. They were not Hades' creations, but they served him. 3 goddesses, born of blood, Alectomagaida and Persephone. They punished crimes, unspoken crimes that violated the sacred bonds, bloodshed within a family, betrayal of kin, oaths broken in darkness. Their presence brought madness, their hands burned. They did not wait for judgment. They enforced it, relentless, untiring, unstoppable. And when they were finished, the soul was not the same. Some myths say they lived near Hades' throne. Others say they wandered, but always they answered to the deeper order. Not Zeus, not Athena, but to something older, too. Justice before law, and that justice found its final expression beneath the earth. Hades, law. Then there was Charon, the ferryman, lean, grim, weathered by centuries of river mist. He said nothing. He did not judge. He only transported. Souls came to him with a coin, an apple placed beneath the tongue, or on the eyes of the dead, not as payment for passage, as recognition of the right to approach Charon without the coin was to be refused. Left wandering the shores of the Acheron for 100 years, not in agony, but in limbo. Charon did not offer comfort. He offered crossing, a single journey, and once it was made, there was no return. He knew every face, but none ever knew his. Then there was Cerberus, the hound of Hades, 3 heads, some say, others say 50, snakes for a mane, a serpent for a tail, but beneath the monstrous image, his role was pure, to guard the threshold, not to keep souls in, to keep the living out. No. Hero passed without facing him. Heracles wrestled him. Orpheus soothed him with song. Aeneas fed him honey and drugged grain. But Cerberus was not cruel. He was loyal. He did not hunt. He did not torture. He watched. He waited. And he defended the one place where no lies could live. Then came the rivers, not people, but forces, each one a border in the geography of the soul. Styx, the river of oaths. Swear by her, and the gods themselves were bound. Acheron, the river of sorrow, the first that all souls crossed. Cocytus, the river of wailing, the sound of grief that never ends. Phlegethon, the river of fire, not punishment, but purification. Lethe, the river of forgetting. Drink from it, and your past dissolved. These rivers were not ruled by Hades. They were his realm. They flowed through the underworld like veins. Each one represented a truth about death, that it binds, that it burns, that it heals, that it forgets, and that it cannot be undone. In some myths, the dead drank from Lethe to forget their life. In others, the initiated drank from Mnemosyne, the river of memory, so that they would return with wisdom. Hades oversaw them all, not by force, by presence. There was also Macaria, a rare, shadowed name. She is said to be the daughter of Hades and Persephone. Her name means blessed death, not tragic, not violent. A death that comes at the right time, a clean ending. She is invoked in a few ancient prayers, a whisper, a hope, that when death comes, it comes as a gift, not as punishment. Macaria never judges. She simply appears when the story is complete. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of Hades' court. Not salvation, not vengeance, but completion. Every servant, every force, every companion, each has a role. Together, they form a system, a cosmic architecture. Not of terror, of truth. Because death is not chaos. It is the most organized thing in the universe. It comes for all. It has a place for all. And in that place, there is order. That is what Hades rules. Not hell, not horror. Completion. The ancient temples fell. The hymns grew quiet. The rites stopped. But Hades did not vanish. He lingered in silence, in story, in the bones of language, and across the centuries. Each new age would look upon him and see not a god, but a mirror. In the early Christian world, he became a confusion. Greek texts were translated, copied, merged. The word Hades became not a name, but a place, an idea, a vague realm of the dead, sometimes hell, sometimes the grave, sometimes a holding space for souls. The king became the realm, and slowly, the man who once ruled with dignity and silence became associated with fire, with torment, with Satan. But that was never who he was. Hades punished no one. He did not torment. He did not tempt. He was not evil. He was necessary. But the Christian, hell needed a ruler, and, when the translators came, they borrowed his name, not his meaning. In medieval art, the image of hell bore monstrous jaws, screaming demons, oceans of flame. And somewhere deep below it all, the word Hades echoed not as a god, but as an abstraction. By the time of the Renaissance, ancient texts returned to Europe, Plato, Homer, Virgil, and with them, so too returned the old gods, but softened, filtered, reimagined. Hades was now seen as a character in a cosmic drama, a stage prop in epics, still distant, still silent, but slowly gaining shape again. In Dante's Inferno, he is present only in name, used as a synonym for hell. But in the margins, scholars began to wonder, who was this god before he was condemned? What did the Greeks truly believe? Romanticisms, centuries later, answered that question. This was the age of mystery, of emotion, of Gothic revival. And in the shadows of romantic poetry and painting, Hades returned, not as a villain, as a tragedy. Poets like Keats, Byron, and Shelley invoked underworld themes constantly. They wrote of Persephone, not as a prisoner, but as a symbol of beauty divided. They painted Hades, not in black and red, but in twilight gray, a lover, a mourner, a figure defined not by fire, but by longing. In this era, artists asked not, why did he steal her? But what is it like to be loved by death? And for the first time in centuries, Hades was no longer monstrous. He was melancholy. In sculpture and painting, he was rendered beautiful, mature, regal, haunted. Persephone became not the victim, but the queen, and with her, Hades was elevated again. They were seen not as opposites, but as balanced. Yin and yang, decay and bloom. In literature, the modern age began to reframe him even further. Carl Jung saw Hades as the unconscious mind, as the guardian of hidden memory. Psychologists and mythologists began to study the underworld, not as hell, but as depth, a place where the soul transforms. Hades was no longer a place of punishment, but of meaning. In modern novels and films, Hades takes many forms, sometimes still villainous, twisted into the satanic archetype, especially in popular media. But also, increasingly, human. In Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, the realm of Hades is ancient and indifferent, not cruel, but bound by law. In Percy Jackson, he is reimagined as a grim, brooding, God-feared, but misunderstood. In Hadestown, the musical, he is the tyrant of a crumbling industrial underworld with control, but haunted by loss. And in countless other stories, Hades becomes the metaphor for what we bury, the secrets, the pain, the longing. He is the lover no one understands, the king no one sees, the father who rules a kingdom of silence. In poetry, he is the moonless night. In psychology, he is shadow. In film, he is both villain and antihero. And in spiritual philosophy, he is integration. We are no longer afraid of him, we are curious. The rise of witchcraft, pagan revivals, and esoteric traditions has brought Hades back into worship, not as a god of fear, but as a guide, a psychopomp. A ruler of boundaries. People leave offerings again. Coins, black, candles, seeds, and always silence, because Hades does not ask for adoration, he asks for awareness. He has become the god of the therapist's chair, the dreamer's pen. The mourner's altar. The artist's stout. He lives not in the sky, but in the pause before the next breath. And in all this time, through all these changes, he has not spoken. He does not need to, because Hades is not the noise. He is the space that holds the noise. And now, after millennia of distortion, his image is slowly returning, not as the devil, but as the king of the dead. Yes, but also of the buried self, of the endings we fear, of the truths we hide, and of the peace that comes when we finally face them. He never asked for worship. He never fought for power. He never stood atop Olympus shouting his name. Yet here he stands at the end of every road, the final door in every dream, the one constant in a world of change, not a god of the sky, not of war, not of love, but of stillness, of endings, of the space beyond. This is Hades, and to understand him is to understand something eternal. From the moment a child in ancient Greece first learned about the gods, they were taught of Hades not through prayers, but through absence. No temple bore his idol in the town square. No festivals shouted his name with joy, because Hades was not a god of presence. He was a god of certainty. You could ignore Ares. You could offend Apollo. You could doubt Zeus, but you could never outrun Hades. He was not a warning. He was a truth, and through that truth, he earned reverence deeper than devotion. He was feared, but not hated, respected, but not loved, and yet, perhaps, he was the only god who was truly fair, because he took all equally, kings and slaves, heroes and cowards, children and sages, and he asked for nothing in return. His realm was not judgment, it was reception. He did not choose who entered. He simply made space for them, and in that space, life could end, which meant life could also matter. If there were no Hades, no death, no boundary, then joy would fade into white noise, pain would become a fog, identity would melt into sameness. It is Hades who makes choice real, because every choice, once made, becomes a memory, and he holds those memories in silence, not to archive them, to honor them. You lived, and so you came to him. That is not a threat, that is recognition. In psychology, Hades becomes the shadow, the unknown self, the unspoken grief, the unconscious root of behavior. To confront Hades is to confront yourself, not as you pretend to be, as you are in religion. He becomes the resting place, the womb of return, the waiting seed, the fertile void. In story, he is the mirror at the end of the path, the reminder that every hero falls, every god fades, every tale finishes. But endings are not enemies, they are part of the design, and in Hades' stillness, new things begin. Seeds rot so they can bloom, skin decays so memory can rise, silence comes so we can finally hear what matters. He is not the devil, he is not evil, he is not cruel, he is the opposite of all those things, because cruelty demands ego, and Hades has none, because evil wants control, and Hades lets go, because the devil tempts and Hades waits. No wrath, no deception. Only the long hallway, only the final breath, only the welcome, unspoken and complete. In myth, he is the ruler of a realm. In truth, he is the part of ourselves that we lock away, the grief we don't face, the limits we don't accept, the memories we bury, and yet he waits for us, patient, unmoved, not to punish, to hold, to give form to the things we're too afraid to feel. And when we are ready, when the masks fall and the noise stops, Hades will still be there, not with a sword, but with a hand, the one that says, "It's over, you can rest." And so this is who he is, the king of the dead, the lord of the underworld, the shadow of the world, but also the guardian of peace, the keeper of boundaries, the final embrace. Hades is not the devil, he never was. He is the end, and the end is not to be feared, it is to be understood.